I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Andrew Price.
Welcome to Deep Cuts, the podcast where we pick a topic and walk you through the ins, the outs, and the nitty-gritty, so you can appear like an interesting and idiosyncratic person at your next forced social function. Today's topic is...
the Shaggs.
What are the Shaggs? They were a rock band consisting of three teenage sisters who, in 1969, released a single album called Philosophy of the World, which went on to become a huge underground cult hit, being called one of the greatest albums of all time by legendary musicians such as Frank Zappa and Kurt Cobain. They've been called musical geniuses decades ahead of their time, and they've also debatably been one of the most secretly influential bands in the history of modern indie rock music. They were also three regular girls who were not musicians at all, but were held prisoner by their father for years and forced to do nothing but practice music because of a prophecy his mother told him as a child.
Act 1. The Call to Adventure. Do you believe in destiny? Have you ever felt somewhere in the furthest, most abstract corners of your mind that there's something more out there for you? That you're not where you're supposed to be? What did you do with that feeling? Did you let it sit there and fester? Internalize it? Allow it to morph into bitterness and despair? Does it still sit with you now? Tuned out but always jabbing like a hot spur at the haunches of your soul? Or have you spent every waking moment living in pursuit of that voice? Do you live each day with uncompromising dedication to choking it silent and still? How far would you go for it? Would you hurt people along the way? Betty, Helen, and Dorothy Dot Wiggin grew up in the 1960s in a working-class family from Fremont, New Hampshire. But wait, that's not the beginning of the story. We'll return to them later. Let's go back further, to the 1930s. Austin Wiggin, the girl's father, was also growing up in New Hampshire. As a kid, Austin's mother was highly superstitious. She was also an amateur palm and tarot card reader. One day, she read Austin's palms and made 3 bold predictions for his future. He would marry a strawberry blonde woman, he would have 2 sons that their grandmother wouldn't live to see, and he would also have 3 daughters who would grow up to be in a massively successful music group. It's unclear what Austin thought of these predictions at the time, but years later, after he'd married his wife Annie, who was indeed a strawberry blonde, and then his mother passed away, and then he had 2 sons, and then he had 4 daughters, one thing became singularly clear to him. They weren't just the idle guesses of a superstitious old tarot hobbyist. It was a prophecy. A prophecy it was his responsibility to fulfill. Austin had always been an oppressively strict parent. As the Wiggins sisters discussed in a 2015 interview with John Ronson for BBC4,
pretty much.
Yes, he was. We couldn't really go too far. We had chores to do. We weren't allowed to go out to dances or anything. We just stayed home. He didn't want us to have so much of a social life. Afraid we'd get too involved on the outside.
Which we probably would have.
Yeah. So.
And whatever we did as a family.
Yeah, that's what it was. We did everything as a family.
The Wiggins sisters spent most of their childhood largely cut off from the outside world, not allowed to socialize or even listen to music or watch movies. But at least they could go to school and get out of the house to see friends every once in a while. That all changed around 1964 when Austin realized that his daughters were selected by God himself or some such otherworldly deity to become a world-famous band. Considering that none of the girls had any musical experience playing instruments, singing, or writing songs, and especially considering that they had largely grown up not being allowed to listen to music at all, so they kind of didn't even know what it was or how it worked in even the most basic sense, Austin knew that they would have to work hard if they wanted to become the next big thing. So he pulled them out of school, completely shut them off from the outside world, bought them all cheap used instruments from a pawn shop, and began the 5-year grueling process of turning 3 teenage girls who hadn't even really heard much music before into a world-famous rock band. And what was that band called? He named them the Shaggs, a reference to a hairstyle that was popular at the time. So, how do you do that? How do you wrench the world's next biggest musical group out of the ether? Well, according to Austin, it was taking them out of school, enrolling them in a mail-order Chicago homeschool system called American Homeschool, keeping them locked inside of the house 24/7 and not allowed to see the outside world, having band practice literally from sun up to sundown 7 days a week, doing calisthenics right before bed, going to sleep, waking up, and repeating.
That I didn't want to do it. No, I don't want to do it. Can't we stop? We've done it too long, and we had to do exercises and everything.
Forgot about those.
Yeah.
What were they?
Jumping jacks.
Yeah.
Push-ups.
Was this all part of the band thing?
He was
Yeah.
probably thinking ahead that he wanted to make sure we stayed in shape to, if it ever happened, or we got to perform, or got to be on the Ed Sullivan Show.
That was his dream. I think he wanted us on the Ed Sullivan
I think so,
Show.
too.
It's kind of interesting hearing what they sound like as older people, because that's not what I would have necessarily thought they would have turned with. The images of them and their music as young people, the way they sound as older people isn't necessarily what I would have anticipated.
Like, because of the accent or because of...
No, I think more just because, I mean, it makes sense now that we're kind of talking about it out loud, but they sound like hardworking mill people.
Yeah, they definitely do. Yeah, I mean, they have these really thick New England accents that, you'll be able to get a sense of, not only just from these interviews, but listening to the music. Like, when we listen to some of the songs later on, the way, some of like the lyrics where it's like, the girls with long hair want short hair.
Yeah, they really do.
But they totally, they sound like humorless, blue collar, normal people.
Yep.
You would never get a sense that any of this happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
5 years. For 5 years, these girls had band practice from 8 to 10 hours a day, never saw anybody from the outside world, and lived every minute of their lives in service of this bizarre fixation their father had with them becoming the new Beatles. So, what was a day in the life at the Wiggin household like during this time? Was it the platonic ideal of the utopian family band depicted in the Partridge Family? Whimsical, moral-filled adventures punctuated by jovial performances of songs that reinforced said moral lesson? Well, actually it was probably more similar to the Manson family, minus the ritualistic murder. Austin Wiggin ran a tight household. While none of the Wiggin sisters have gone so far as to characterize their father as abusive or cruel, well, actually one of them did, but we'll get to that later. By all accounts, they have established one salient truth about Austin. In the Wiggin household, it was his way or the highway. And he did not suffer any pushback, complaining, or disrespect towards his cherished prophecy. You see, in the Partridge Family, an entire family of 6 copacetically forming a band, spending every day practicing music together, touring the countryside, performing for delighted crowds, and all agreeing that that was just a swell way to live their lives, was a piece of magical realism effortlessly forged in the writer's necessity for the story to have a premise. You don't have to wonder if this whole family band thing will pan out, and whether or not your entire childhood will be ruined in pursuit of a fruitless and decidedly not your dream. Because it's just taken for granted that you will become successful because you're on a TV show, so of course it's all going to work out. In real life, the only way you get your wife and 6 kids to all collectively agree to spend 5 years writing and practicing songs in the hopes that one day it'll all suddenly pay off and you'll no longer be a lower middle class family from ass end of nowhere, New Hampshire, is by ruling with an iron fist and building a household dynamic where everyone, including your wife, is scared to go against anything you say for fear of your wrath. Imagine if, instead of Shirley Partridge sitting down with David Cassidy and talking him through the girl troubles he's having, which segues into a beautiful duet between the two of them on growing up and adapting to more mature issues, instead she just snarled at him to shut the fuck up, get back to his room and practice his scales, and if he got any more wild ideas about dating girls, she'd throw him into the sin pit in the backyard for 2 days. This is something that we're going to continue to talk about this and delve more and more into the details and the context and discuss it more, but right here, the one thing that has just sat with me through this entire, researching and learning about this story is, and I want to talk about this more in depth kind of at the end of the show as a kind of like a closing thought, but the way that everybody involved in this story, whether it's the daughters themselves or the fans, the people who have found them and appreciated them, totally underplay and kind of just don't talk about the fact that the Wiggin sisters' dad was a horribly abusive tyrant. Like it just kind of gets left out of it gets left out of the narrative, and when in the way that it's talked about in sort of the periphery of it is just that like he was really strict and he was kind of nuts, but it's never on its face like called out like he was horribly psychologically abusing them for like 10 years.
Yeah, it's funny. I was kind of, when we were talking about this and when I was reading your script, I was kind of like, this is kind of the nightmare scenario of like the Jackson 5. Like the Jackson 5 could have very easily been this. And because this guy is, I don't even know if he's if he's worse or better than Joe Jackson. Because like Joe Jackson beat the shit out of those kids. But they made $1 billion, so nobody cares.
Yeah, it's a success story. You can kind of shrug that off. And also I think, yeah, I mean, and also it wasn't really talked about until later on. Whereas like we came into this story with this, like as people discovered the Shaggs, we'll talk about this more as the episode goes on, and we've talked about this on previous episodes. This idea of whenever like the narrative becomes a part of the appeal of the thing, and it's like a movie or a band or whatever, where like the sort of the struggle that they've faced is like part of what's good about the thing or what's interesting about the thing. And there's a lot of examples of that in previous episodes, and kind of most specifically, I think the George Lazenby episode, and just the whole concept behind like he was only in one of the Bond movies, but his story is so compelling that you really love him holistically because of everything surrounding his involvement in the franchise. But the Shaggs are kind of like the quintessential example of that, where not only is like the behind the scenes narrative like makes inform the music and make it more interesting, but the music wouldn't be good without it. It wouldn't mean anything without the story. It's this. We're gonna talk about outsider art later on more in depth, but this music and its existence and its level of relevance is inexorably tied with the events that surrounded creating it. So it's like, okay, the Jackson 5, they made this great music, but behind the scenes, their father was this really abusive tyrant who basically exploited them and put them through horrible conditions. Not one of which, allegedly could have possibly involved chemically castrating one of his sons so that they would maintain their like vocal range, which if true is just one of the most despicable things that you could even think of. But is that a real thing? People think that he chemically castrated Michael? Yeah, that's one of the widely held beliefs that like lives somewhere between conspiracy theory and like genuinely evidence-based belief. That shit is horrible, but in terms of the music, it's really not related to that stuff that was happening behind the scenes. That stuff is like that's like an additional thing that you kind of discover, and then it may or may not deter you from being able to actually listen to the music. Like you could find out that shit of what happened behind the scenes with Joe Jackson, and you just kind of be sort of ethically turned off from. Do you really think so, though? Don't you think that there's some correlation or causation between a driving force making you harness your natural talent, whatever that is, and pressure cooking it like a diamond, Oh yeah, 100%. I just mean from a consumer perspective, or from somebody enjoying the art. You listen to the Jackson 5 and you enjoy that because it's great pop music. And you would never need to know any of that stuff. And when you did know it, it might actually off-put you from, being able to enjoy the music. Whereas with this, the music, and I really don't want to get into talking about like analyzing the music or talking about my feelings about it yet until later on, but the music cannot exist without the story. I think the way I would phrase that is that there's almost kind of like an artistic algebraic equation that describes this conundrum, and there's two versions of it. There's like good art, like well-crafted art plus trauma equals enjoyment, culturally successful, critical acclaim, whatever. Bad artistic quality plus trauma gets you the same thing almost. Yeah. It's almost kind of like the end is the same, but you get there by different paths. Yeah. There's a human fascination with like
wow, you went through all of this and it fucking sucks? Wow.
Yeah.
Or, wow, you went through all of this and look what you achieved.
Yeah,
And then minus both of those things, like if you don't have artistic talent and you don't have trauma or one or the other, you just get like weird, bland, like Nickelback music.
well, then you just get 30 Seconds to Mars.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, what you said, the idea of it being different paths, I think that is spot on because the idea is like, okay, what you started about saying about how well-crafted art plus trauma or pathos or whatever equals this great, enjoyable experience. Bad, poorly crafted art plus this crazy narrative or pathos or whatever equals almost the same. But it's not that like, oh, that person that did like the good thing, like you didn't even have to try that hard. You could have just shit out something and it would have been elevated by your story. There's still an insane amount of effort on both ends of that spectrum. There are just two different ways of approaching it, and one could never do the other one, basically, because when we get into outsider art, the idea that like they genuinely did not know how to do it any other way, and this was their just attempt at making something in a vacuum of ignorance and lack of self-awareness, whereas somebody who makes this incredibly immaculate, beautiful piece of art based on a knowledge and an understanding of a craft and an incredible amount of talent, they cannot do that. They cannot replicate that without it becoming arch or performative. You're just when you're good at something, you're incapable of having that like naive, innocent, fresh-eyed approach to something like that. You make things in a completely different way that's also very good, but you are unable to do that other thing, and they are unable to do your thing because they just literally can't. Amateurs
have raw inspiration, professionals have skill and craft, and those two things don't always go hand in hand.
Yeah. The Wigan girls describe this period of their lives as bleak and devoid of any enjoyment. Days dragged on for them as they did nothing but practice music that they didn't even want to be playing in the first place. No friends, no boyfriends, no malt shops or drive-ins, no dances. Not even really any normal day-to-day stuff like reading books or watching TV. Just practicing in calisthenics. They said that they couldn't decide which one was worse, the days that they had to do calisthenics or the days Austin decided that instead of doing calisthenics, they should just practice music for another hour before bed. So, what exactly was the Shaggs as a band? What were they doing for all those hours locked up in the basement practicing? Dot and Betty both played guitar, and Helen played the drums. Dot wrote all the songs, from the lyrics to the melodies, and Betty helped her out with developing the melodies. In a situation like this, you can never be completely clear as to what the true story is, but at least officially, all of the music that the Shaggs ever released or performed was written entirely by the three girls during this period. The girls have also said that their father was their harshest critic, mercilessly ripping apart their songs and forcing them to perform them for him over and over again until he felt like they had finally gotten them right, which he never did until literally towards the end of his life. It was all like a somehow sadder and more abusive version of Whiplash, except if J.K. Simmons' character had yanked Miles Teller's character out of a medical school and forced him at gunpoint to try and become a jazz drummer and then threw a chair at his head. Their lives were not their own. They were conduits and avatars for somebody else's inner demons being worked out in real time. They were not a band. They were somebody else's clenching heart.
The interesting thing about Austin Wigan to me is that he's this massive control freak, but up to a point. Like that, the thing about him forcing the girls to write their own songs is so interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because you would think that he would have wanted to either, I don't know, if they're living out this prophecy or fantasy or wish fulfillment for him, you would think that he would have been involved in writing the songs or coming up with them, or like they literally are an extension of him. And for their ideas to be personified in the actual music is such a bizarre, dissonant frequency that kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, Is it true that they wrote the music? Is it true that Dot wrote all the lyrics? The reason why I want to talk about that, I have some specific reasons and some specific ideas about the lyrics and we'll discuss that. But also, the reason why I want to talk about that is because from my perspective, if I were doing this, if I had become obsessed with this idea and was trying to fulfill some weird prophecy that my mother told me when I was a kid, and I had become consumed with this concept of turning my daughters into a successful music group, I know that if I were to do that, which I would not, but if I were to do that, I would write the music. Like I wouldn't be able, if I was that obsessive about something, I know that with my level of kind of like wanting to control things and wanting to do things myself and wanting things to be perfect and things like that, I would just end up writing all the songs. I would maybe like attempt to let them write them, and I would immediately get frustrated and do it myself. And I can't, there's a part of me that can't reconcile that he wouldn't feel that same way with this level of obsession that he had over this.
Without getting too deep into it, do you think he didn't write them because he's not a creative person?
Well, I mean, I'm just repeating.
Never mind. Well, all right.
At one point, however, practicing wasn't enough. Austin realized that the girls needed to get out and get some real world experience. They needed to play shows. Concert events were not common in small town New Hampshire, and it was going to be a challenge to get enough people to come out and see an amateur band full of local teenagers. But Austin was nothing if not pragmatic. He may not have had any kind of grand vision beyond blindly fulfilling a random palm reading his mother did when he was a child. He may have been a simple blue-collar mill worker with 6 kids and not much money to his name, but one thing he knew how to do was jam his foot in the door, even if it ended up crushed and bleeding. Their first performance was at a talent show in a nearby town in 1968. Up until this point, the girls had been performing in a vacuum. No audience to give them feedback and no real frame of reference for what good, popular music even sounded like. Well, on this night, the vacuum was ripped open. They went on stage and jangled out a few cover songs on their out-of-tune instruments and were met with jeers, boos, and even soda cans being thrown at them. They already hated playing the music and being in the band, and now they had even more of a reason to hate it. Even whatever dim illusion that they were actually going to be big stars one day that their father had gaslit them into believing during those long days practicing in their house was shattered that night. They were more miserable than they ever were.
Me, it was always, just can't wait till we're done. Because I didn't think we were any good.
The worst experience that I remember is having soda cans shot at us on the stage.
So if you were worried that you weren't very good, then that must have confirmed it.
It must have. Kids used to pick on us and this and that, say how bad we were, so...
Yep, make fun of us.
Yeah.
Was it upsetting?
Embarrassing. I think to me it was just embarrassing.
What were they saying?
We didn't know what we were doing. Music was trash. Hurts their ears. Things like that.
Thinking about this, I can't even imagine, because this whole timeline is kind of like it feels compressed because there's certain sort of story points throughout this whole thing, and we're kind of hitting them. But in reality, if you really pay attention, if you looked at the timeline and really looked at the years and the amount of time, a lot of this stuff was really spread out over long periods of time. So reading the story just as points, you don't really get a sense for how long all of this process was. And the fact that from the point that he sort of first closed the shutters and nailed the doors shut and decided to stop letting them go out into the world and practice every day, to the point whenever they were playing this show, it was literally years. They were just trapped in their house playing songs for years before they ever did this. So I can't even imagine, the thought process that you go through and how it would feel and how it would affect you emotionally and psychologically to be in this vacuum for years where you're being forced to do something that you do not want to do, and the only feedback you get on this thing is just criticism, unyielding criticism, this sucks, this is not good enough, do it again. And just to spend years of your life with just only this negative feedback loop, and then to go out into the world and play this music and really have no idea, have no frame of reference for what you're doing or how good it is or anything like that, because the same person who's telling you that you are going to be a huge star one day and that you're destined for greatness is also like, you fucking suck. You fucking suck. And then to go out and be like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what I'm doing right now. Just the concept
I've
of what,
literally never heard music before.
yeah. And then to go out and then do this thing that you literally just don't know what you're doing, and you have no idea how anybody would react to it. And for the initial reaction right out of the gate is people just being like, fuck this, and throwing soda cans at you. Like, that must just fuck you up so bad.
And also the fact that people are yelling fuck you in a Boston accent.
Yeah. Fuck you.
Fuck you. Fuck you. Get off the stage.
Yeah.
Fuck you.
I mean, everything is just more abrasive and fucking like cutting over there. Like, it's all this on top of just being in a very abrasive place.
Dot, I heard you in a band called the Shaggs, Dot.
This is wicked
Fucking
bad.
stop it. It's wicked bad. Stop it. Fuck you.
Yeah, man, I don't
mean to make light of these poor women being tortured.
Yeah.
Like, they literally got their entire childhoods were stripped away for this weird Don Quixote-esque vision of success. Fuck you.
Yeah. What was Austin's answer to the crushing feelings of humiliation and defeat the girls felt on that night? Well, they just needed to go home and practice more. In Austin's mind, he took the age-old adage, practice makes perfect, literally into its logical extreme. He believed that endless repetition would have a mathematical termination point at which time the Shaggs would become great. Young group of girls plus relentless practice equals fame and fortune. And in certain shades, he was kind of right. This is how you accomplish greatness. You push and push until you're exhausted, fed up, and completely drained, and then you keep pushing until you feel on the verge of utter collapse, and then you push it just a little bit more. His one fatal mistake was failing to realize that there's another vital ingredient to the recipe that is required to make all that practice mean something. Passion. None of them had it. Not even Austin himself, who was described by his daughters as not particularly liking music before he became obsessed with them outselling Elvis. And going back to what you said before, and the idea of like maybe he just wasn't a creative person and couldn't do it, it very well could be the case because he didn't like music. The reason why he didn't let his daughters listen to music is because he didn't like listening to music, because he was this weird isolationist who thought that like the secular world would corrupt you and that you shouldn't be exposed to it. Which is odd. Like, I also wonder, like, why did he grow up like that? Because his mom seemed like she was like in the 30s to be somebody who's like really into tarot card reading and palm reading. Like, she seemed very kind of like out there and like kind of weird for the 30s. So it wasn't like he grew up in this very like strict, tyrannical, like fundamentalist environment. So I wonder why he grew up that way, or why he grew up to become that way.
Yeah. Well, isn't it? I mean, that to me sounds like a fairly logical extreme reaction, right? Like, if you grow up and your mother is a medium and is a part of the 1920s and 30s counterculture, you know, interest in, you know, being a medium and doing seances and talking to the great beyond and these occult things, you're like, I don't want to be anything like you. I hate you. I'm going to be rigid and straight and narrow Christian. I'm going to be a good person, you know, right down the middle. And then that itself is a very human thing to like, I'm not going to be anything like you, but also you're weird. And I'm going to reject all your beliefs. But also that one time that you said that I would have daughters and they were going to be mega famous rock stars. That's the one thing I'm going to hold on to. Like that dissonant frequency is exactly what people do.
Yeah, it's like a little shred of another world that he latched onto that is completely contradicts every other aspect of the way that he's chosen to conduct his life. But then that little tiny shred of that other world ends up becoming the totality of his world, regardless of any of the other rejection of that, and the fact that like 99% of his life has been crafted to be contrary to that, that little tiny seed sprouted and fucking consumed him. Like that last scene in The Fountain, whenever when Hugh Jackman gets to the Fountain of Youth and the fucking plants grow out of him and shit.
I mean, that's why the phrase "methinks that I protest too much" is so ubiquitous in our culture now, because people are constantly railing against the thing that reminds them of themselves the most.
Yeah.
And, whatever happened to him as a kid with his mom that put him on the straight and narrow, that moment where she was like, "You're going to have 2 sons and $3, even though you're going to have 4, and they're going to be famous musicians." Like that. I don't know why his mom has a Southern accent.
I was going to say, she's from New Hampshire. Like, she sounded exactly like the rest of them.
Yeah.
Maybe she migrated.
Look, she's from the southern part of New Hampshire.
Maybe she was whatever the opposite of a snowbird is.
Andrew, as someone who's been to New England once, I am an expert, okay?
As somebody who's never been to New England, I have no choice but to accept that premise.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At this point, life for Betty, Helen, and Dot was a never-ending feedback loop of pain, boredom, and personal humiliation. Their days stretched on into infinity, practicing music they didn't care about, only to be punctuated by the occasional shame of having to perform in front of a group of kids they desperately wished they could just be friends with. The next time they performed was that Halloween at a local nursing home. They did a set including one of Dot's newly written songs, It's Halloween, which is easily one of the best songs on their album and beats out This Is Halloween as the greatest song of all time about how it's currently Halloween. At least this time they didn't have to embarrass themselves in front of a bunch of peers. The elderly nursing home patients were kinder and politely clapped after their performance. The show felt less like a walk through a social life-ending gauntlet of hot coals and more like a slightly patronizing grandmother disingenuously complimenting your refrigerator art. But this was only the beginning for the girls, because Austin had finally found a golden opportunity to put the Shaggs in the spotlight. The town of Fremont was looking to host a regular get-together for the local youth, something to keep them from getting into trouble, running with the wrong crowds, and devolving into a debaucherous life of crime. Every Saturday night, they were going to transform the town hall into a big dance for all the teens in Fremont, full of food, age-appropriate drinks, and live music. Austin was in the right place at the right time and negotiated for the Shaggs to become the resident house band for the Saturday night town hall shindigs every week. Everything we know about Austin Wiggin and just how he is as a person, you got to assume that the reason why he was able to get this opportunity is because he goes to every single town meeting. He goes to every single town meeting. And to the point where it's literally like, they're like, oh, like, I don't think the turnout's going to be that big this time, so we should probably just cancel the meeting. And then they like announce that they're going to cancel it. And then he's like, no, we're doing the meeting. I'll be there.
I drove all the way here from my house. We're going to have this meeting and you're going to talk to me about the Shaggs.
Yeah. And then they talked about this and they were like, okay, here's what we're going to do. When we have the next town meeting, nobody talk about the dance thing, because you know for a fact that Austin's going to try to get that fucking band to play. So nobody say anything. We'll not talk about it. We'll have a separate meeting that we won't invite him to, like an off-record meeting, and we'll talk about the dance. And so they do the meeting, and then one of the guys is like, and then on to the next order of business, the town hall dog sitter service. And Austin was like, what was that? And they're like, nothing. And then they're like, oh, that was a close one. And then they do the secret meeting, and then he's just there, and he's like, I fucking knew it. I saw it in your fucking eyes.
A little bird told me that you were having a meeting, and I'm over here to tell you that the Shaggs need to be the band. The kids love the Shaggs. They love the Shaggs.
The kids love the Shaggs? They've never performed. Oh yeah, they did perform.
There's word around town. This is Halloween. The old folks told the grandkids, told the friends.
I heard this wonderful new rock outfit.
The Shaggs. Kids love the Shaggs. Come on. And then he did it he guilted everybody into it. Like he has leverage on every member of the town board, where it's like, Jimmy, come on, I lent you my silverware that one time two New Year's ago. Come on.
They're like, fuck, fine.
Shit.
I wish we weren't even doing this now.
We have to do it. You know that Jolene Johnson is getting in with some rough crowd. If we don't do this, she's going to end up pregnant.
Yep. This became a regular part of life for the Wiggins sisters. Before this, for years, they only ventured into the outside world to go grocery shopping on Friday nights, attend Sunday Mass, and occasionally sneak out of the house to swim in the nearby watering hole when their father was at work. In any other circumstance, the ability to go and hang out with the entirety of the teenage population in town every single week would have been an exciting new chapter in their lives, but for Betty, Helen, and Dot, it just became another source of trauma. If they weren't already, they became the local laughingstock of their peer group in town. Kids went to either openly mock them in their music, or at the very least passively annoyed that their racket was ruining an otherwise enjoyable party. Many kids from the time who've been interviewed now remember going to the dances exclusively to socialize with friends and just tried to tune out the music. And if you thought that the servitude towards Austin's prophecy was isolated to just the three sisters, the entire Wiggin family participated in these town hall events. Annie, his wife, ran the concession stands, and his two sons played minor instruments like tambourines and maracas in the band. Austin and Annie's fourth daughter, Rachel, doesn't seem to have had much involvement at this time, though she will eventually end up joining the band later. Up until this point, the Shaggs and the Wiggin family probably merely existed as an odd blip in the periphery of the social scene in Fremont, if even that. Austin was a private person and didn't make a habit of bragging or doing much socializing in town at all, and considering the isolationist nature of what the family was doing, it's possible that nobody was even aware of the existence of the band until the town hall shows. But after the shows became a regular occurrence, the town started talking. Austin became an elusive, enigmatic, and scandalous figure. Rumors spread about how he kept his daughters locked away in a basement and forced to practice music, which weren't even rumors, that was just true. There was even a rumor that persisted in town that Austin was carrying on incestuous relationships with his daughters.
God, I hope not. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, there's some stuff we'll talk about later, but that part of it certainly paints everything in a different light. He's already obviously psychologically torturing and abusing these girls. It's a horrible thing, but they seem to have come out of it not totally fucked up. They seem like normal people, but if this part of it is true, then yeah, it just paints it in a whole different fucking light. But what the town saw as a bizarre, concerning, possibly illicit situation, Austin Wiggins saw as just the beginning of a meteoric rise to fame. After a few months of the town hall shows, he decided that he couldn't just sit around and wait for the girls to be discovered like he'd been assuming would inevitably happen. In order for the prophecy to be fulfilled, he'd have to carry the Shaggs across the finish line himself. He decided it was time for the girls to cut an album. In March of 1969, 5 years after he'd pulled the girls out of school and handed them musical instruments, he rented out a day at Fleetwood Studios in Revere, Massachusetts for the Shaggs to record their first LP, a collection of tracks they'd been slowly writing, developing, and practicing over the last several years. And once again, going back to just like the time span of this, 5 years, the fact that this is like a poor, lower middle class family that struggles to make ends meet and lives paycheck to paycheck, and he's got 6 kids working just at like a blue collar job. The fact that they did this just relentlessly for 5 years, and he made the decision to drop the money on this recording session, like, it's insane how dedicated he was to this thing.
Especially having fucking 6 kids or 5 kids or whatever. Like, that's just, it's expensive to make a record now, let alone in 1969. That's got to be like a whole times, a whole month rent, a whole quarter's worth of money or something. Like,
yeah.
What did he do for money again?
He was like a mill worker. He worked at a factory.
You don't make a lot of money being a fucking factory mill dude.
Yeah. But it's just like it's just crazy how far he followed this. It just consumed him. We've talked about this on other episodes, like Tom Hansen and him kind of like weirdly becoming obsessed with trying to prove that the guy who he saw the bathroom was the Zodiac Killer, which, you know, a lot of that may or may not have just been a lot of like kayfabe. You know, plenty of other examples of this like obsessive, like allowing something to consume you. The same thing with, you know, Robert Graysmith from that story from, you know, the character that Jake Gyllenhaal plays in the movie. But this guy, like, I mean, the story's not over yet, but all in all, like 12 years and all this money just on this idea that of something his mom told him when he was a kid. It's like fucking insane. There's not a lot of information about that first recording session, but the engineer at Fleetwood, Jeff Landrock, who would end up recording their second studio session in 1975, which ended up becoming a compilation of unreleased tracks in 1982 called Shaggs' Own Thing, remembers the odd sight that the family struck and how utterly miserable and checked out the girls seemed during that session. We can only assume the original recording session in 1969 was a similar experience.
And there's a knock at the door, and I see 4 girls, a brother, and Austin and Annie, the mother. Oh, maybe these are the helpers, you know. And hi, I let them in. They didn't say a word.
Did they look kind of miserable?
They did. They didn't look like they wanted to be here at all.
I remember saying, let's just get this over, to myself. I did not say it to my father. Let's get this over and get out of here.
Let's get this over and get it out of here.
Let's get out of here. Their accents are so strong.
It's more than just the accent, though. She's got like an underbite. She's like, I love it. It's great. I want to spend time with her. She's how I imagine Granny Goodness sounding. I love the way she sounds. Just said to myself, let's get this over with. I didn't say it to my father, but I said it to myself.
Landrock went on to say in another interview,
They didn't really seem enthusiastic, like they were doing something great. It was more like this was their chore. Like, instead of washing dishes at night, they were recording an album, you know? So I just sort of set them up live, and it was quite horrifying. They didn't say hardly anything. They were sort of loosened up towards the end, but they didn't really say, wow, this sounds great, or anything like that. Almost like they knew it wasn't regular stuff. I don't know if they did it just to please their dad, but he was just saying it was great and all this stuff and asking me, don't you think this is great? And these kids are gonna be stars. I've been an engineer for long enough to know you don't agree, but you don't disagree. I sort of hid the fact that I did the album for a long time. I didn't want my name associated. I didn't want people to know I did that, you know?
Rewinding back to the original 1969 recording session that yielded their debut/only album, the engineer at the time, Bob Hearn, upon hearing what the band wanted to record, actually urged Austin to reconsider spending the money. He suggested that they go back and practice a little bit before dropping the cash on laying down tape. The Shaggs were apparently so bad that a member of the music recording industry, one of the most notoriously sleazy and exploitative industries in human history, was like, I feel bad taking advantage of you like this. Please do not give me your money. However, Austin was not having it. And as he told Hearn, I want to get them while they're hot.
Jesus.
Which is just like, what the fuck does that mean?
I have no idea.
So Hearn promptly shrugged, took Austin's money, and recorded the Shaggs' debut and only album, The Philosophy of the World. Austin himself describes the album best, or perhaps in no way accurately in any way, shape, or form, in the liner notes of the album that he wrote himself.
The Shaggs are real, pure, unaffected by outside influences. Their music is different. It is theirs alone. They believe in it, live it. In all contemporary acts in the world today, perhaps only the Shaggs do what others would like to do, and that is perform only what they believe in, what they feel, not what others think the Shaggs should feel. The Shaggs love you. They will not change their music or style to meet the whims of a frustrated world. You should appreciate this because you know they are pure. What more can you ask? They are sisters and members of a large family where mutual respect and love for each other is at an unbelievable high, in an atmosphere which has encouraged them to develop their music unaffected by outside influences. They are happy people and love what they're doing. They do it because they love it. That sounds like, you know how in the Tony Wong episode we were saying those portraits seem like portraits of like a dictator in hiding?
Yeah.
That seems like a missive from a dictator.
100%. I mean, as I say here, this reads like a news report from North Korea.
Fuck yeah, it really does. It really fucking does.
Yeah, it reads like a, because those missives, like that, like propaganda news reports, or like those messages about like a dictator, they're sort of like purposely read in this very kind of like hypnotic, rhythmic way that's meant to desensitize the meaning of the words to you. And that's how this is written. It's also so crazy because it's odd how spot on and self-aware Austin is about some aspects of what he says, primarily in regards to how the Shaggs sound is untouched or informed by any outside influences. And as we'll discuss later, it's very interesting that he specifically chose to use the word outside in his description of the band. This description, because, you know, Austin just wanted his Daughters to be like a huge popular music group. Like he wanted them to be the Beatles or the Chordettes or the Supremes or whatever. That was his idea of what they would be, and it was based on just this idea that his mom said that they were going to be a huge popular music group. But he specifically chose to do it in this way by locking them in their house and not allowing them access to the outside world, and creating this music in a vacuum. And then in these liner notes, he specifically, you know, he makes it a point to discuss this and really focus on this idea that their music is untouched by outside influence. It is, you know, not affected by the outside world. He specifically writes this. It makes like a point of this in the liner notes of the album. And that's so fascinating because there's this concept that we'll talk about later, which is this concept of outsider art, which is sort of a third-party analysis from a academically minded music appreciator or music expert, analyzing and assessing music created by a person who, for whatever various reason, doesn't have any understanding of how music is made and lacks a certain self-awareness. And so the music that they create has this sort of pure, innocent, untouched quality to it. But Austin doesn't know any of this. Number one, this idea of outsider music hasn't really been shaped yet. And he certainly doesn't have any conception of what that is. He wanted his Daughters to be just a popular rock band. So it's so crazy that he's talking about this, and it's almost like outsider music. He coined this concept before it was ever really coined, but he did it like on an accident. So like he's an outsider artist or like an outsider analyst.
He's like an outsider academic almost.
Yeah. It's so weird that he kind of like accidentally hit upon this in the same unself-aware quality that outsider music artists make their art.
And it's funny too, because like a lot of outsider art stems from people that are either very low income or have traumatic experiences. And so they use art as a therapy, like a therapeutic device to try and expunge some of that, but without any actual formal understanding of what the given artistic medium usually requires, like what the core tenets of it are, what the staples of whatever genre that they're working in. And that's why it's usually interesting, and usually why it typically blows up in the fine art sphere is because these people die in extreme circumstance. This is not all outsider art, but a lot of the big examples like Henry Darger, they're artists who live extreme lives and or make work in an extreme fashion that is very antithetical to the typical way that work is created. And then when they die, a bunch of this work is found and there's a narrative around the work. And there's kind of a sister quality of that to this, where it's this bizarre singular ecosystem constructed by someone as a matrix to deal with pain.
Yeah. And then it sort of autonomously sort of works its way outward and is sort of discovered by people in this way that the original person didn't necessarily want to happen or didn't have control over. Like the girls certainly didn't want it to happen, and even Austin did want it to happen, but he still had no real control over the way that it happened. Like he wanted them to just get discovered by a record label and become huge stars. He had no idea that it was ever going to happen in the way that it specifically happened. And it certainly probably wasn't the way he wanted it to happen.
Yeah, and a lot of outsider art for me, one of the reasons why I brought up Henry Darger is I genuinely like Henry Darger's illustrations because he was a very either developmentally stunted or had post-traumatic stress syndrome. He didn't like adults, so he only kind of bonded with children, so he only wanted to read about children. So he had a bunch of like turn of the century children's adventure stories, like, you know, the Bobbsey twins, all the stuff that I like. And so what he would do is he would trace the illustrations from those books onto his giant tableaus. So there's all these like weird patterned drawings of like tracings of girl adventurer, boy adventurer, dime store novels. And I just genuinely think they look really cool and weird and neat. And I think a lot of outsider artists, there's kind of like a cultural elitism where before we had irony as a cultural discourse or way to understand something, we had this kind of like, in the fine art world, there's this very almost elitist, like classicist approach to things where it's like, well, I went to RISD and I have, 7 bachelor degrees and I know everything there is to know about fine art. And look at this person. They didn't know anything. Isn't that fascinating? Look at this savage that didn't know anything. Like, normally outsider art feels very, very like shitty and egotistical and like, yeah, they have stories that are interesting about them that I am drawn to sometimes, but the fact that they're made so, the fact that there usually is this kind of cultural looking down your nose at somebody of just like, I can't believe he's painting with tar. Isn't that amazing? Look at, he painted an F with a tar stick. It's just like, fuck you, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that because I was going to talk about the exact same thing because that really is what it is. Like, there's this weird thing.
That's not in here, right? I didn't read it.
No, it's not specifically, but there.
Oh, okay.
But
it's just weird to me whenever we're. I mean, it happens fairly frequently when we're like on the same page like that. But it's just really weird that you were also thinking the same thing. Yeah,
because the thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that people who are really into outsider art, and there's going to be more discussion about this later, but there's these 2 types of people. Well, there's secretly 3, I think, but there's like 2 types of people that are into outsider art. And there's a type of people who think it is this like genuine, honest expression of somebody's pathos or their trauma or pain or just their personal narrative, like unfiltered by classical theory or understanding. And then there's the people who like are into it ironically because it's like so bad it's good. The other people, like, they hate those people and they're like, they're enjoying it for the wrong reasons. But almost like that, have you seen that meme where it's like, it's a screenshot from some movie or something? I don't even know what it is, but they're in like a old church and there's somebody sitting in a pew and then somebody sitting behind them pointing a gun at their head. And then the camera backs up and then there's somebody sitting behind them pointing a gun at their head. And then the camera backs up wider and then there's a sniper up in a tower, like pointing a gun at them. And I feel like the sniper, because even the like purest outsider art people, they're really condescending and they're viewing these people like children. Like even the guy who coined the term outsider music, Erwin Chusad, who took like the idea of outsider art and like created this subgenre of it and sort of branched it off into this other separate thing. That dude is a dick. Like the way that he talks about the people, he's like mocking them. And he's the one that encapsulated what outsider music is. Like he's the one that shaped it into a discussed piece of academic intellectualism. They look down at them like they're like specimens or like children that they're observing, and like you said before, like, oh, how fascinating. I can't believe, like, can you believe that he did that? And it's like, it's like annoying. It's like, what the fuck are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, and I get the impulse to want to be that way when you're so insularly in the bubble, you know. I understand it, but it just feels weird to me whenever it happens. And I obviously I feel that way about Henry Darger too, where I'm just like, what the fuck? Like the dude spent his entire life making this story. His entire life. That is so crazy. And he never showed it to anyone. Like,
yeah. But it's just, I mean, it's just like these, I mean, we're literally right about to get to the actual music and hear some of it. So, you know, all this stuff will become made a little bit more clear. But, you know, like with the Shaggs, like, I do not look at this in that way. I don't look at this as just like, oh, like how fascinating that these simpletons, you know, made music in this way or whatever. Like, when I listen to the Shaggs, like I feel a tremendous sense of kind of sadness and like empathy, and some of the stuff I just really genuinely love. And yeah, I just don't think about it like that. I don't think about it like I'm like looking at like weird specimens in some like circus or something like that are just doing this fascinating, unself-aware thing. Like
the way I would describe the way the Shaggs sound is, you know, that I mean, you were a fucking theater kid, but being a theater kid, there's a very specific laugh that people in school do at theater kids, and it's not like an actual laugh. It's kind of like you're like walking in the hallway and somebody will go like, huh. You know what I mean? Like it's got like a chortle or like a
yeah.
It's if that scoff was internalized by somebody, and then the feeling that you get when someone scoffs at you like that was turned into music.
Yeah. It's just people who at all times feel 2 inches high.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
The album took all day to record, which was grueling for the girls, but is actually a very short amount of time to record an entire fucking album. So how are they able to record in that short amount of time? Because they recorded the entire thing in one room in a straight shot. While in the early days of recording, it was fairly common for a band to record their music together live in one room, and it still continues to be done in certain situations, though usually with a lot of overdubbing after the fact. By this time in the late 60s, it had become standard for recording studios to track instruments separately. The engineer was confused to find out that Austin wanted him to just set up a bunch of microphones in the room and let them play. He was also even more confused when he found out that Austin wasn't really interested in doing multiple takes of songs or trying to re-record or overdub mistakes. They got everything in nearly one take and were done, which is so odd that Austin Wiggin was obsessed with grueling, repetitive rehearsal over a period of literally years, standing over his daughters and yelling at them to start over anytime they made the slightest mistake. And yet when it was crunch time to actually immortalize the music on wax forever, he was just like, yeah, sounds fine, whatever, moving on. It obviously was influenced by the money that was burning each minute they were using the studio, but it seems like such an egregious mismanagement of priorities. So, we're here. We've described in stunning granular detail what everyone's reaction to the Shaggs has been. But what do the Shaggs actually sound like? What's all the fuss about? Well, it's not only the title track, but it's also the opening track, and whether done on purpose or by complete accident, it's also the perfect introduction to what you're getting into when you listen to the Shaggs. Let's hear a bit of track 1 on Philosophy of the World. Philosophy of the World.
Oh, the rich people want what the poor people's got, and the poor people want what the rich people's got, and the skinny people want what the fat people's got, and the fat people want what the skinny people's got. You can never have anybody in this world. The short people want what the tall people's got, and the tall people want what the short people's got. The little kids want what the big kids got, and the big kids want what the little
I don't know if you've looked at this yet, Dave, but just like look at this album cover for Philosophy of the World.
Oh yeah, I know the pain. I know the pain that's in those eyes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Once again, going back to my allusion to how the liner notes sounded like a North Korean news report, this looks like the looks on their faces are like in a picture where like a North Korean citizen, like a factory worker or something like that, is like being forced to like take a picture with Kim Jong-un. And they're just like, you can tell that right before they snapped it, they just pointed a gun at them and said, "Look happy." That's what this picture looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so brutal.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm unclear on is like, why do Dot and the other one that plays the guitar,
Betty,
why do they have matching costumes, but the other sister
but
doesn't?
then Helen doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I get the sense. I mean, just to speculate, I mean, they pretty much were all just completely unwilling to ever push back against their dad, push back against Austin. You know, like what he said goes. So maybe I find it hard to believe that if he told her to put on an outfit that she would have resisted it. But also, you know, just in the totality of the story and all the different elements of it, I do get the sense that Helen, I mean, she was the oldest, so it makes sense. But also she was like the closest to like rebellious or like kind of outside or like the black sheep of the family type thing.
That's why they were like, sit in the back, you're on drums.
Yeah, so maybe she just resisted wearing it, or maybe not even necessarily that she said no, but maybe like she convinced her dad that like it would be cool if she was wearing like a different thing. I don't know. Yeah, it's weird because their matching outfits are like, they're not just like, they're fairly complex matching outfits. Like they're not just like wearing the same color. These are some weird outfits that they specifically got 2 pairs of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like they went to a thrift store and found 2 amazing, you know, floral jackets and matching plaid skirts. And then we're like, sorry, Helen, they only had 2.
Yeah, they only happen to have 2 of these exact identical, very strange outfits. Here's some of the lyrics from that song in case you didn't understand.
Oh, the rich people want what the poor people's got. Oh, the poor people want what the rich people's got. Oh, the skinny people want what the fat people's got. Oh, the fat people want what the skinny people's got. And you never please anybody in this world.
Did you just wipe your brow like James Brown?
It's like, it's so fucking hot in here.
Everything from the physical playing of the music to the lyrics to the fact that the song structure consists of a series of guitar runs with the vocals exactly mimicking it, while the drums hack away in the background, providing no actual rhythm for the song, hits you over the head with this aggressive expression of naivety and innocence. If it were trained musicians attempting the avant-garde, it'd be too on the nose and performatively ironic. If it were little kids, it'd be cute. But from Helen, Betty, and Dot at this point in their lives, and considering the holistic context of the fact that they weren't musicians, they didn't want to be in a band, and they were literally being held prisoner by their obsessed father and forced to write this music, the simplistic absurdity of every piece of the music feels profound. It's a simulacrum of something someone forced you to make, and in a vacuum of not knowing what that thing is, you reinvented it from scratch. It's music from an alternate reality where music hadn't been invented yet in the 60s. It's a soundtrack for a post-apocalypse that happened exclusively in the Wigand household. It's also brimming with this eerie feeling of deep sadness. The playing feels rushed and sloppy, like it's played by a child who just wants to get it all over with so they can go home and go to sleep, which might be the only real peace they feel in their lives, because that's literally what's happening. I played a little bit of this in the car when I was driving. We were driving yesterday, and my wife, Jaden...
My wife!
She kind of knew the story because I've been like talking about it, or she's just been overhearing discussions or overhearing like videos I'm watching and stuff like that. So she knows what the thing is. And she just like, she told me, she was like, you got to turn this off. Like, this just makes me feel really sad. Cause it's like, it's all there. If you know the story, it's all there. It's all out there. When you hear the music, it's all there.
The thing that's so weird to me about it is the fact that they didn't have any sense of, like in printmaking, there's a thing called registration marks where you put little X's at the top corners and the bottom corners of a page. And then when you do different layers of printing, like a lithograph, when you pull different colors, you line up the plates so those registration marks line up so that your image comes out as a clean image where all the lines are over the color palettes or the color fields in the way that you intend them to be. And sometimes, those registration marks slip or you're just not good at making them. And, you get these weird kind of like ghosted, weird like images. And the Shaggs music sounds like it's music made with no registration marks. It's like they didn't understand obviously they didn't understand this because they didn't listen to music, but like they didn't understand the idea of setting up a beat and then having things function on top of the beat in a rhythm that would go in time with that beat, which is just such a bizarre, it's like you were saying, like you can't unlearn what you already know. And I played classical piano since I was like 5. So learning or hearing those weird, like Helen, like not even be able to keep a beat. And like the beat itself is just so strange and not even syncopated. It's just like someone smacking the drums. Like it's so bizarre.
It's almost impressive in what it is, because like you said, with the level of understanding and not being able to unlearn it, like I've also played music for my whole life. I play the drums. I've played the drums in many bands. I also play guitar. And whenever you're playing with other people, or when you're playing along to
Carly Rae Jepsen,
when you're drumming along to Carly Rae Jepsen blasted, at full blast on like 5 stereos that are set up strategically throughout your house so that you have this sort of surround sound experience where no matter where you walk in your house, you are blasted sonically with CRJ. You can't help but lean into the rhythm. People as social creatures, when you're playing music, you that's the reason why you can like play a song and somehow you're able to anticipate the timing and the rhythm of what's being played, even though you aren't listening to a metronome being played, and you can kind of keep a consistent BPM, and you can go back and be like, oh yeah, like you can take this live performance and you can set it exactly to the album version because they maintained the same tempo throughout the entire song, because it's just like this weird human nature to be able to like meet in the middle and stay synchronized like that. So the fact that they were playing live together in a room and somehow they didn't have that coalescence and lean into each other's rhythm and somehow meet in the middle. And the fact that they were consistently able to sit there with Helen like playing this other song while they were playing that song. And for all of them to be able to do that together in a room is almost impressive. It's like, how did they do that? It's like impressive in the opposite way. Like, I don't think I would be able to physically do that.
I kind of side with Jaden though. I was listening to it this last week or so, getting ready for this episode. Like I could kind of only listen to the songs in like short bursts. Like, cause at first I was just like bopping around the house being, like, and then like, it kind of has that Phil Spector wall of sound thing that we always talk about, but it's like a wall of depression.
Yeah. I mean, it's like if the Jackson 5, if you could just hear the abuse in the music.
Yeah. Which is so funny because a lot of their music is just kind of like the content is just so like childish and innocent and like kind of non sequitur. But then also if you know what you're looking for, it's just like super dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. However, their most definitive song is probably My Pal Foot, a song about Dot's lost cat, Foot, that is so genuinely bizarre in its atonality, arrhythmia, and abstract lyrical content that you could believe it was actually generated by a modern AI that had been fed 30 years worth of children's music, but somehow accidentally added in a bunch of recordings of pre-concert sound checks and drum sets rolling down hills.
always likes to roam. My pal's name is Foot. I never find him home. I go to his house, knock at his door. People come out and say, Foot, don't live here no more. My pal.
And then there's Things I Wonder, whose lyrical ideas are so abstract and yet so simple and direct, you can't help but oscillate back and forth between thinking they're some of the most profound words you've ever heard or some of the most glib.
There are many things I wonder, there are many things I don't. It seems as though the things I wonder most are the things I never find out. I wonder about.
Here's a couple of the lyrics from that song in case you couldn't understand the vocals.
There are many things I wonder, there are many things I don't. It seems as though the things I wonder the most are the things I never find out.
It's one of those statements that, like, on its face, you're just like, yeah, man. But then you think about it and you're like, wait a minute.
And then you think about it again and you're like, yeah. And then you think about it for a couple more minutes and then you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah. And you just get stuck in an infinite loop of like, I feel that hard. And then like, wait a minute, that's meaningless. That's just gibberish.
And then you're like, but what is life unless it is gibberish?
Yeah, it's just...
And then you think about it some more and then you're like, fuck you, little girl, you don't know anything!
And then sooner or later, you're just naked in your apartment, weeping openly.
With like a Sharpie tattoo of Helen Wiggins' face carved into my right pectoral.
Yep. Yeah, it unfocuses your clear thinking and sends you off into a spiral of the abstract. And then there's Why Do I Feel, which is low-key the most poignant song about reflecting on your own inner emotional state, anxiety, and fears that's ever been written.
Sometimes I feel funny and bothered up inside. Then for some reason I just got to cry. Sometimes I feel happy and overflowing with joy. Then things change and I start to worry. Why do I feel the way I feel? Why do I do the things I do? Why do I feel the way I feel?
And here's some of those lyrics.
Sometimes I feel funny and bottled up inside. Then for some reason, I just start to cry. Sometimes I feel happy and overflowing with joy. And then things change and I start to worry. Why do I feel the way I feel? Why do I do the things I do? Why do I feel the way I feel?
So, based on everything you've heard so far, the entire story leading up to this, the way this music sounds, the tight control Austin Wiggin held over his daughters, and the way they look on their album cover, how old do you assume Helen, Betty, and Dot are? I wouldn't blame you for assuming they're young children. For a majority of my knowing about the existence of this band, I completely thought they were preteen girls when they recorded Philosophy of the World. What if I told you that at the time they recorded this album, Betty was 18, Dot was 21, and Helen was 22? It makes sense because this is 5 years after they went into the bunker to start practicing to become a band. So when this whole thing started, they were all young teenagers. This is like some full-blown dogtooth shit. I thought that they were kids, and it actually doesn't really make a big deal out of the fact that they were that old. Like, I haven't seen there's no documentation on this that points that out and is like, it's fucking crazy that they were like in their 20s and like being held prisoner and forced to do this.
They were all legally adults and could have left.
Yeah, it nothing says that. And it's only briefly mentioned in kind of passing in some random article where they talk about reissuing the album later on. And when it was first reissued in the 80s, they kind of did like a different cover. But then when they reissued it again in the late 90s, they wanted to reissue kind of like the original packaging. So the article is about that, and it's like, so they use the same album cover with, the three girls standing, holding their instruments, and then gives their age at the time. And that's the only reference to it. And I kind of double took that. I was like, what? They were in their 20s when this happened? It's insane.
It makes it sadder.
Yeah.
Because it's so depressing, the like death grip that Austin Wiggin had on them. that he like just robbed them of their entire lives, basically, up until 22 or whatever.
Yeah, they did not have childhoods.
It's awful.
Yeah, and when you when you think about it, like we're human beings get a certain period of time on this earth, and it's all we have. The entire point of our existence is to experience our lives, and we have a finite amount of time to do that. So
it is? I thought the entire point of being on Earth was to make work. It's not to just sit at a drawing desk and make work for 14 hours.
But I mean, that's what that is. That's the experience. I'm not saying experience as in like going to see the fucking pyramids or something like that. Whatever your version of experience is. So, 22 years or longer, because this carried on, almost 30 years. Subtract maybe like when you were a baby or a toddler, because you don't really remember that time. So let's say 25 years that, and not only 25 years, but 25 of like the years that are like supposed to be your free years where you can kind of just drift around carefree, doing whatever you want, and not having to worry about like life's problems and grappling with existentialism and all this stuff. And they just didn't get it. Like that's pretty fucked up.
It's really sad. It's really, really sad.
1,000 copies of Philosophy of the World were pressed by a record dealer in a nearby town, but Austin only received 100 of the copies. The other 900 copies, along with the money Austin paid as well as the shady record dealer, disappeared and were never seen again. Maybe those missing 900 copies of the album have something to do with the later cult success of the Shaggs that we'll discuss soon, but back in 1969, Austin only had 100. He distributed them around town to radio stations, maybe got a few of them to half-heartedly bite, but ultimately got no attention from the media. The girls continued to play the town hall shows, but years went by and the upward trajectory of the band that Austin took for granted would happen had completely stagnated. Nobody wanted to play their record. No record labels were coming out to the town hall shows, and people just ultimately didn't give a shit. The best the Shaggs ever got in their hometown was a weird novelty that raised eyebrows and fueled rumors. But by 1973, people in Fremont had long stopped caring. That year, the city decided to end the weekly town hall shows for undisclosed reasons. Austin no longer even had a venue for the band to continue to perform, but he was still sure the girls would eventually make it. It really gives a lot of context to hear that music. Because as much as I love the album, and you can sort of appreciate it in this way that we're appreciating it now, as a band that was supposed to just become a mainstream popular rock group, how delusional do you have to be to hear that 8 years into the process and go, still gonna happen any day now, right around the bend, any second, I'm gonna get that call. And it's gravy boats and
we can finally afford to get Helen a matching uniform.
Yep, and we finally can buy that third dress at the thrift shop. Like, how delusional do you have to be? Like that,
the answer is very delusional.
It's not music. It's not even.
It's like noise music, but not even.
Yeah, he kept forcing them to practice every day and have no social lives. He made them continue to play shows wherever they could, including the nursing home. He was white-knuckling his blind belief in the prophecy, but the walls were starting to close in around him. The periphery of doubt was coming into full view. The flames of mediocrity were licking at his feet. The voice in the back of his head was taunting him. The girls were also starting to get tired of their father's oppressive rule. They were less and less willing to blindly submit to every whim as they got older. However, no matter how fed up they got or how much they started testing the boundaries of rebellion, it's astounding how deferential and fearful of Austin's wrath they were so far into their 20s. Helen eventually met a boy at one of the town hall dances and had secretly eloped with him behind her family's back. However, she was so utterly terrified of telling him that she ended up living at home, pretending like everything was completely normal for 3 whole months, before finally working up the courage to tell her father she had gotten married and kinda needed to go live with her husband. Austin promptly pulled out a shotgun and left to go track down the poor guy. Helen eventually left the Wiggin household in the tight clutches of Austin, and he didn't talk to her for months afterward, until he realized that nobody else could play the drums.
That's so fucked.
And let me remind you that Helen was 28 years old at the time. 28.
That's so fucked up. I feel so bad for her.
I'm
for all of
32.
them.
This was a couple of years ago for me. To think of a couple of years ago, if I was just like being held prisoner in my parents' house, not allowed to leave.
Actually, now that I think about it, we met about the same amount of time that they had been doing the Shaggs. So there is a possibility that this podcast and every creative venture that we've been on, the web series, the shorts, they've all been me shaggsing you, and you actually aren't married and don't have kids.
Oh, 100%.
I'm playing Jaden, I'm playing the kids, I'm playing everybody. Also, I know the name of your kids. I just didn't want to say them because I don't know if we've said them on the podcast yet. I didn't know if you wanted to have their names be public.
Oh, you mean JJ the Fourth and Phoenix WK?
I'm Phoenix WK. I forgot if you had said his name on the podcast yet. Yeah.
After hearing your Boston accent, honestly, I could see you pulling it off.
I am about the size of JJ the Fourth.
Mm-hmm. I guess it explains why JJ the Fourth just sounds like Paul Lynde. I've always thought that was weird.
And Daddy, I need to go poopy.
Yeah, it haunts me whenever he says that.
Well, aren't you just a little guy?
Is that him talking to his poop?
Daddy, I had an accident.
Oh, God.
Oh, my.
Disturbing. I hate this. In 1975, the Shaggs went back into the Fremont studios to record another album. It was the only thing Austin could think of to do. They weren't getting any new gigs other than the occasional local fair or nursing home pity show that was essentially the equivalent of your grandma scrounging up a butter rum flavored lifesaver out of her purse to give to you. Radio stations wouldn't play Philosophy and nobody wanted to buy it. Maybe they just needed to record a new one, so they went in and recorded a bunch of new material. As the engineer Jack Landrock recalls, they had actually majorly improved since the last session in 1969. They actually kind of sounded like a real band of musicians who kind of knew what they were doing. However, apparently they were still not nearly good enough, and Landrock still suggested to Austin that maybe he shouldn't blow his hard-earned money on recording the material. Austin once again persisted, and they recorded. At this point, the fourth Wiggins sister, Rachel, had joined the band as the bassist, which is just another example of weird outsider art, that they had two guitar players instead of a guitarist and a bassist.
Well, everybody knows that bassists are just guitarists, but not as good.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but you got to have somebody there like anchoring it, because you got the drummer who's going all over the place, and then like if you got a good guitarist, then he's like flipping it. They're flipping it over their shoulder, and they're doing that thing where they play the guitar with their teeth. You got to have like the anchor who just stands there with the stance and just plucks it out to balance out the scene. But yeah, I just think it's weird that they had two guitarists and no bassist, and they just didn't realize that like a complete rock outfit needs to have the bass sound in order to kind of like
That's what you're surprised at?
Anchor the low end of the sonic frequency.
These people don't understand what a beat is, and you're just like, I can't believe they didn't understand that you need a bass to anchor the low end. Motherfucker, they didn't understand what 4/4 time is.
They didn't. They really didn't. They still recorded the whole thing live in one shot, and the entire experience was once again bizarre and surreal for mostly everyone involved, except for Austin, who was basically seeing everyone around him as anthropomorphized dollar signs and stars wearing sunglasses. The material from this session was never released for reasons that will be explained shortly, but in the 80s, it eventually came out as a compilation of unreleased tracks called Shaggs' Own Thing. Here's some of the opening track, You're Something Special to Me.
You're something special to me. 2, 3, 4. The world is big, you're not so grand. I still say you're quite the man. Oh, you're something special to me. 2, 3, 4. When I hear your voice, I know you're the one that makes me glow. You're something special to me. 2, 3, 4. When I
It's amazing that they're all 45 years old and have actually managed to sort of play music.
I mean, they're all like almost in their 30s at this point. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't like Shaggs' own thing as much because they feel like it sort of like lost some of its like naive innocence of the first album, and it certainly
they heard a song somewhere in an elevator and were like, oh, this is what it's supposed to be.
That's what I'm supposed to be doing? What the fuck? Why didn't you tell me, Dad? But you know, a lot of people don't like it as much because of that, and it's certainly not as interesting. But I actually really like it. Like I that song, You're Something Special to Me. It's the opening song, and just the sort of like whimsical flourish of opening up the song with a lyric that's like, you're something special to me, and then like counting down the empty measures is just something about that is just very charming to me.
Also, the same stylistic through line of the melody of the guitar mimicking the vocal melody note for note is so strange. It's stranger in this because there's context for it now. Where in the original work, it's everything. There's just, you know, it's 17 different things happening incorrectly at once. Where here, there's only one thing happening incorrectly, which kind of makes it more digestible in its strangeness. Which is why it's understandable to me why people don't like it as much, because it is more digestible. But I think I kind of side with you too, in that I really liked it because of the fact that it, like, that is, let's put it this way, that's something I would actually listen to. I don't think I would ever actually seriously just put on Philosophy of the World just to like have it on in the background. You know what I mean? Yeah,
I mean it's definitely kind of like it's kind of like a academic experience to listen to it. Whereas, yeah, it's just kind of more straightforward music that you could just enjoy as music.
Yeah. But also it's straightforward music that is still kind of clumsy and weird and fucked up.
Yeah. But it also, I mean, especially Shaggs' own thing, especially that album, I feel like whether a lot of people realized it or not, this music has been like very influential on modern indie music.
Monkey on your back is the latest trend. I don't see what anyone can see. And anyone saw got bored at the temple, looked around at the 7-Eleven. I know you think I'm a psychopath, Democrat lurking in the dark.
I think the reason, you know, that song specifically, like I could see an indie band from like 2007 putting out that exact song. The reason why the recordings from the 1975 session were never released as an album is because that year, at only 47 years old, 11 years into the grand quest to fulfill a prophecy that his mom had given him as a boy, after facing roadblock after dead end, after plateau, after false start, and ultimately never getting to see that prophecy fulfilled, Austin Wiggin died of a massive heart attack in his sleep. Without the oppressive clutch of their father to keep them pushed in the direction of the pursuit of fame and fortune as a band that they never wanted to be in the first place, the Shaggs immediately disbanded. Helen was already living with her new husband. The rest of the Wiggin children followed suit, with the two brothers, Betty and Dot, all moving out and starting their own families as well. Austin's widow, Annie, the strawberry blonde that kickstarted Austin's mother's prophecy, sold the house to another family. However, after a while, the family started reporting experiences of seeing a ghostly figure of a man in the house. The experiences persisted, and ultimately, the family decided to have the entire house demolished and built a new one on the property in order to rid themselves of what they genuinely believed to be the specter of Austin Wiggin, still tied to this earthly coil by his unfinished business. And that's that. The band was over, and the Wiggin sisters all moved on to regular, boring, normal, working-class New England lives they all basically wanted from the very beginning. A decade passed, and the Shaggs just became a really fucking weird and traumatic thing that happened to them as kids. However, that was far from the end of the Shaggs for the Wiggin sisters or the world. And, spoiler alert, Austin's prophecy eventually gets fulfilled.
Thanks for listening to this episode. You should definitely go like the Facebook page for the Deep Cuts Pod, because we do lots of cool video content on there that you'll be sure to like. Also, please join our Facebook group.
That's Deep Cuts Podcast on Facebook and the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group. Also follow us on Instagram at Deep Cuts Pod. Act 2. Refusal to return. Imagine that when you were a teenager, your mom or dad forced you to act in some humiliating home movies. I'm sure we've all experienced that. Somewhere in your garage is a tape that contains something that mortifies you every time your parents whip it out at holidays and get-togethers. But ideally, it just becomes a distant memory that you only occasionally are reminded of as a relic of your childhood. Now imagine that, a decade later, after you've long forgotten about it, suddenly Frank Zappa starts talking about how it's the greatest home movie of all time in nationally televised interviews. In the most quintessential personification of that scene from Back to the Future, where Marty McFly noodles away at a hard rock guitar solo and is met with blank stares from his audience of 1950s high schoolers, only to say, I guess you're probably not ready for that yet, but your kids are gonna love it. Whenever the 1980s rolled around, people were ready for the Shaggs. There was no precedent set for the atonal, amusical, expressionist texture that Helen, Betty, and Dot were accidentally creating back in 1969. Sure, by that time we already had outsider artists and avant-garde composers like Arnold Schoenberg, Igor Stravinsky, John Cage, legendary Stardust Cowboy, The Residents, Wildman Fisher, Captain Beefheart, and even Zappa himself, but they were all either on the far fringes of culture at the time or rooted firmly in a more academic hemisphere of music. The Shaggs were trying to be a pop group, and people just thought their music was really horrible and badly performed rock and roll. But the 70s firmly transitioned experimental music into the mainstream, and in the 80s, Zappa had a genuine crossover hit with Valley Girl, and we also got motherfucking swordfish trombones. Tom Waits spent the entire 70s in 7 albums establishing himself as a stool and piano jazz guy, only to hard left turn towards the avant-garde in the 80s in perhaps one of the most astonishing misdirective acts of implanting experimental thinking and sensibilities into a popular context of all time. There were more and more regular people getting into really weird experimental bullshit by the day. It was no longer relegated to college radio stations, bargain bin vinyl crates, and the Dr. Demento show. People may not have been enjoying it for the right reasons, but it was getting out there, such as this 1982 Captain Beefheart appearance on Late Night with David Letterman.
So midnight hat size, it's a very unusual.
He needed a hat. They called my manager, Gary Lucas, who is also on this album, and called him in the middle of the night, said he wore a size 8 hat.
Yeah.
Now that's impossible.
It is impossible? That's a pretty big hat,
it's
isn't
possible,
it? Yeah.
But it's impossible in this case.
Well, what size hat does he wear?
7 3/8.
Oh, good.
Which ain't bad.
Yeah.
But not an 8.
No, not an 8, sure. If you're just joining us, we're talking about hat sizes. And now you have an interesting name yourself. Can you tell us a little of the origin of Captain Beefheart?
Captain Beefheart, a beef in my heart against the society.
Mm-hmm.
They're cutting the beaks off of penguins down at the marina in L.A. You know that, the water.
No,
Cutting the beaks off of not pelicans. Cutting the beaks off, the top beak.
I know, yeah. But why are they doing that?
I don't know, but I sure would like to find who's doing that.
Well, that's...
They need a spanking.
Obviously, the entire point of the segment is meant to just show how weird and insane Beefheart is, so Letterman can straight man off of him and roll his eyes for the audience, but at least one of the pioneers of avant-garde outsider art was on a nationally syndicated television once. So this is the context in which tiny mentions of the Shaggs started popping up here and there. Much like a modern-day internet meme, it was never quite apparent where the true origination of the implanted idea came from, as part of the identity of a mimetic idea that allows it to even work on a fundamental level is the concept of stripping it of its authorship so it feels like it winked into existence in the collective consciousness. But one of the loudest voices that stood out among the crowd was that of Frank Zappa, who started talking about the Shaggs in many of his television and radio interviews. Here he is on an episode of the Dr. Demento show where he's teeing up a spin of My Pal Foot.
Frank Zappa, I remember the very first time I ever talked with you on the air, it was just locally here in Los Angeles, and you brought along a a small box full of your favorite records. There was some Stravinsky and some R&B, but there was also an album by a group called the Shaggs, three sisters from New Hampshire whose father put out a record of them on his own label.
Yeah.
It's since become a minor hit on my show.
Well, let's pump it up, make it a major hit. I think it's time for a resurgence of the Shaggs. With the New Hampshire primary coming up and everything. Pump the Shaggs a little bit.
My pal.
Yeah, man, pump the Shaggs, man.
Yeah, a circumstantial. I talked about this idea. We were talking about this earlier about just like the kind of elitism of the sort of outsider artist, academics, and critics. Another sort of circumstantial aspect of this entire research is that kind of happened to me is Frank Zappa is one of my favorite musicians of all time. I've been a huge Frank Zappa fan since I was. I've been listening to the music since I was a kid, and I got really into Frank Zappa in high school. And I was hugely obsessed with him, not only just from a musical standpoint, but I like looked up to him or kind of respected him as like an intellectual thinker as well. But watching a lot of these old interviews and kind of digging into this stuff, part of me is kind of glad that Frank Zappa died, because I know that his brand of anti-establishment, anti-censorship, provocateurism back in the 70s and 80s would have morphed into a like anti-politically correct libertarianism in modern day, like Terry Gilliam's has. Like, I know it would have happened, because as much as I love that guy, like he is such an arrogant prick.
I mean, look, you either die a hero or die a hero.
Yep.
He died a hero.
Yep.
I think it's interesting because there's a lot of overlap with stuff I like and Frank Zappa, but I've never really gotten into him. And I think the main thing that turned me off is the soul patch.
In a lot of ways, Frank Zappa is the direct opposite of something like the Shaggs or something like outsider art. I think actually the true direct opposite of something like the Shaggs is something like Dragon Force or something. Just this really
it has no meaning, but it's all technical craft. Yeah.
But Frank Zappa was maybe a little bit further to the left of that spectrum. But yeah, his music it's very tightly crafted, and he basically would get like the best musicians in the world. So at one point, like Steve Vai was one of his live guitarists, and like Steve Vai is another one of those guys. It's like he's an amazing technical guitarist. He might be one of the best in the world, but personally, I have no interest in Steve Vai's music. Like it's fascinating to watch Steve Vai play, but I get nothing from his music. It's just emotionless, technical chops. It's a demonstration of human excellence, and that's it. There's no emotion or meaning behind it. And so Frank Zappa, he took that. He would take somebody like Steve Vai and use them basically as a tool to create texture in this bigger conceptual thing that he was doing. So his music is much more interesting and experimental than something like Dragon Force or Steve Vai or Joe Satriani or Yngwie Malmsteen or whatever, but it's all centered around this incredibly technical, incredibly complex wall of composition as opposed to wall of sound. So it's in a lot of ways it's very the opposite of this, where you listen to Frank Zappa music and you're just kind of hit over the head with this level of like technical proficiency.
You get zapped.
Yep. Yeah. You did it. You fucking did it.
Fucking did it.
Did we mention that Zappa regarded Philosophy of the World as his third favorite album of all time? He is often credited as having said that the Shaggs were better than the Beatles, but that's actually a myth, though I wish it were true. Eventually, after the trickling up of the Shaggs into the zeitgeist of the late 70s, early 80s experimental music scene, Philosophy of the World ended up in the hands of members of the rock band NRBQ. The band, namely founding member Terry Adams, were transfixed by the album and they so happened to own their own indie record label called Red Rooster. They decided they wanted to reissue Philosophy of the World, and so they set to work tracking down the remaining members, our girls, Betty, Helen, and Dot. So, where were they? Basically scattered across nearby towns around Fremont, married with teenage children. They'd long forgotten about the Shaggs. Except probably not, because I don't think there could ever be a way to erase the kind of trauma that they most likely experienced during that period of their lives. But they at least put it out of their minds. They'd sold all their musical instruments. They even had taken their husbands' last names, making it nearly impossible for Terry and the record label to track them down. They went to the public library in Fremont and eventually were able to get phone numbers for the sisters. They met up with them and proposed the idea of reissuing Philosophy of the World on their own record label. The sisters were confused, and it was clear that some level of PTSD bubbled up to the surface because they immediately started getting defensive about the proposition, asking how much it was going to cost them and what level of commitment they were going to have to make. Terry blew their minds when he told them that he was going to pay them and they didn't have to lift a finger. Philosophy of the World was reissued in 1980 on vinyl and was immediately a hit in the indie and experimental music scene. Word of mouth about the album spread like wildfire, with many fans discovering it being played in hip record stores of the time.
But I didn't hear the music until way later when I was working at a record store in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and somebody played it in there. That's when I first actually heard the music.
Erwin Chusett, a music historian and inventor of the term, described the Shaggs as one of the first outsider rock artists, together with Wildman Fisher and Captain Beefheart. Outsider music is an offshoot of the outsider art movement. It's music created by self-taught or naive musicians. The term is usually applied to musicians from outside the music establishment who exhibit childlike qualities, and especially those who suffer from intellectual disabilities or mental illnesses. And really, as much as the Shaggs were rediscovered and placed within the bucket of outsider music, there's such a personification of what outsider music is that the term might as well have been coined for them. Of all the musicians and composers who have been associated with the outsider movement throughout history, the Shaggs were the least compromised of experiments, completely isolated from all secular pop culture throughout their childhoods, cut off from socializing with other people, left in a vacuum to basically invent what music was to them based on some basic descriptions of what it was supposed to be. As Austin Wiggins said all those years ago on the liner notes of Philosophy of the World,
"The Shaggs are real, pure, unaffected by outside influence. Their music is different. It's theirs alone. They believe in it, live in it. Of all contemporary acts in the world today, perhaps only the Shaggs do what others would like to do, and that is perform only what they believe in, what they feel, not what others think the Shaggs should feel."
It's almost like Austin Wiggin invented the concept of outsider music and not Erwin Chusett. The reaction to Philosophy of the World was huge. No longer side-eyed as a sad bunch of untalented weirdos, the Shaggs' music was now being compared to the textural complexity of the free jazz movement of the early 60s, spearheaded by alto saxophonist Ornette Coleman.
It's hard to describe the Shaggs sound. It's not based on rhythm, which is why everyone always thought Helen, the drummer, didn't know what she was doing. She knew what she was doing, she just wasn't doing what Dot and Betty were doing. It's based on melody, and it follows the melody ruthlessly without regard for rhythm. I don't think Dot hears rhythm. I'm not sure about that, and I'm certainly not insulting her when I say that. I think she hears music in a different way than the rest of us do. I think she really only hears the melody, and the melody goes where it will, and if you're lucky, you follow it.
One review by Lester Bangers in the Village Voice at the time said,
"They recorded an album up in New England that can stand, I think, easily with Beatles 65, Life with Lions, Blonde on Blonde, and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks as one of the landmarks of rock and roll history. They can't play a lick, but mainly, they've got the right attitude, which is all rock and roll's ever been about from day one."
Which is so weird because I don't think they do have the right attitude. Like,
yeah,
they
at all.
They're just like
"Can I go home now, Mom?"
Catatonic zombies that just want it to be over.
Yeah.
That's where the Better Than the Beatles quote originated. Eventually, Kurt Cobain would say Philosophy was his 5th favorite album of all time. There was such a great response to the reissue of Philosophy that Terry and Red Rooster wanted to take those unreleased songs from the second studio session the band did in 1975, as well as some unreleased tracks from the original 1969 session, and issue a compilation. The sisters agreed, and in 1982, the label released Shaggs' Own Thing. Own Thing isn't as highly regarded as Philosophy of the World, as a lot of people believe the recordings lost the initial pure, raw innocence and creative spark that Philosophy had. But personally, I enjoy it. at a very similar level.
I agree. I also personally enjoy it. Very, very good.
The three sisters each embodied a balanced spectrum of feelings about this newfound interest in their music. Dot actually kind of liked the idea of it and embraced the attention. She even ended up expressing that she had enjoyed writing and creating the music during her childhood. Betty actively disliked...
Kayfabe.
Yeah, I mean, I was literally going to say the same thing. Betty actively disliked anything that had to do with the Shaggs and had to basically be convinced and cajoled by Dot into signing contracts, speaking to record label people, or showing up for events and appearances. Helen couldn't care less either way. And yeah, like 100%. It seems very much to me, there's a lot of things going on with the legacy of this in retrospect. The glossing over of the abuse, the kind of like explaining it away as like he was just really strict and kind of crazy. The fact that she later on, as this happened and as she started kind of like, I think later in her life, just kind of liked the attention and liked the idea of like doing something creative and doing something more with her life than she was currently doing at that point in her life. You know, I think
and
that,
why wouldn't you? Like everyone would. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think she kind of like retconned some things a little bit and started kind of acting like she was having fun back then, even though she definitely wasn't. And that she kind of owned the work more. Like I think like she owned it as if she had some kind of personal connection to it, or she felt some kind of positive way about the things that she created, despite the fact that I feel like that's probably not true at all. And she probably deeply hated those songs. And
yeah, it's the thing we talked about on the Stratemeyer Syndicate episode where Leslie McFarlane's family, after he died, was like, our dad loved ghostwriting the the books for Hardy Boys. They were his life's work. He loved them. When in reality, Leslie McFarlane fucking hated them.
Yeah, it's just it's a cleaner narrative because my dad was just kind of a weirdo and we made these weird things and I liked it. And now I'm gonna
definitely didn't sexually assault me and my sisters over years and force us to be in this weird cult of three.
Yeah, that's a much better narrative for like going out and doing public appearances and performing as the band and starting your own band and making new music. That's a way better narrative than I experienced over a decade of terrible abuse at the hands of a obsessed psychopath. And
who also may or may not have been a ghost.
Yeah, and who may have been a ghost, and I hated every second of it. It's a better narrative to sell yourself as. However, although these reissues and the ensuing explosion of popularity of the Shaggs in the indie and experimental music scene cemented them as a cult favorite in the early 80s, it never really affected the sisters much. They still lived their regular lives in New Hampshire with their families, and in the 80s, before social media existed, they probably had no real idea of what was happening with their music and were able to forget about the Shaggs again, save for a few royalty checks here and there. Years went by, and in 1999, the sisters were asked to actually perform as the Shaggs at a NRBQ 30th anniversary concert. Dot wanted to do it. Betty didn't. However, Dot pressured Betty into going by saying that she was going to go with or without her. Betty didn't let her go alone. However, Helen was in poor health. She had been suffering from clinical depression for years, possibly from as far back as her childhood in the late 60s, living under her father's oppressive rule, and was not interested in ever doing anything Shaggs related again. So Betty and Dot performed at the concert, and shortly afterward, a huge feature story about them was written up in the New Yorker by Susan Orlin. Once again, this drummed up renewed interest in the Shaggs, and the same year, Erwin Chussid, discovering that a company he worked with actually owned the rights to the Shaggs catalog of music, worked with them and RCA Victor to once again reissue Philosophy of the World, this time a remastered version based on the original master tapes that Dot had found in her closet a few years prior. In 2001, a Shaggs tribute album titled Better Than the Beatles was released, featuring covers of Shaggs songs by artists such as Ida, Optiginally Yours, R. Stevie Moore, Deerhoof, and Danielson Family.
I know one of those bands.
Yeah, I know Deerhoof, and that's it.
Same.
Tragically, after years struggling with clinical depression and living on disability with dire health, Helen Wiggin passed away in 2005. Betty returned to her normal life with her family in New Hampshire, as did Dot, but she also didn't want to completely give up the renewed life as a musician, and in 2013, she formed the Dot Wiggin Band with a handful of musicians that were Shaggs admirers. They released an album called Ready, Set, Go on Jello Biafra's indie label Alternative Tentacles. On the record, Dot writes and sings lyrics while being backed up by a band of professional musicians. It's not quite as interesting, charming, or unique as Philosophy of the World, but Dot actually says she has much more fun performing those songs than the old stuff. Here is the song Banana Bike from Ready, Set, Go.
She gets on her banana bike and pedals all around. She gets on her banana bike and travels through the town. There's just no stopping her, this is for sure. She gets on her banana bike and pedals more and more. She meets up with her friends and goes and goes and goes. Where's her destination? Sometimes no one knows. She disappears for days on end.
It's funny that the Dot Wiggin Band stuff is kind of more childlike than her stuff she made when she was a child. It kind of sounds like music that would play on like a PBS kids show. Or if this was all like a 50-year IP farm scheme to get the Wiggin Band show on PBS.
Yeah, to take over for Pink Fong whenever Baby Shark waned in popularity. It's interesting that the music, listening to the Dot Wiggin Band, both the album and just a lot of the live performances, it's so funny because it reminds me a lot of the later Daniel Johnston stuff, whenever he basically had the same experience where a young group of musicians that loved him and knew about his music wanted to be his band. And so, later on in the 2000s, Daniel Johnston started performing with this band, and it kind of like transformed his music from this, very primitive outsider music to just a very kind of like generic rock band backing an outsider artist. And it just sounds the same. It's got that same quality of like, there's like this weird cognitive dissonance between the sort of lack of self-awareness of the person singing and then just this really kind of rote, generic, uninteresting backing music.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't actually put that together in my head, but there are a lot of similarities between them and Daniel Johnston.
I love something about the idea where there's all these like younger musicians who just like love this person so much that they meet them and they're just like, can we just fucking start a band? And then like there's something cool about that idea. But yeah, the music is just, you're destroying the experiment. You're infecting it with your like level of understanding of music. So
yeah,
it's
your ironic hipster scoff is toning out the primal innocence of the talent at hand.
Yeah. Eventually, in 2017, the two remaining members of the Shaggs, Betty and Dot, reunited and announced a reunion show. Along with a backing band, they performed all of the old Shaggs songs to delighted crowds of new and old fans. Here's a performance from 2017 of My Pal Foot Foot.
His name is Foot Foot. He always likes to roam. My pal's name is Foot Foot. I never find him home. I go to his house, knock at his door. People come out and say, Foot, don't live here no more.
It's so weird to see them as older people doing it. Like, It's so strange.
Yeah.
I felt the same way when Daniel Johnston was touring towards the end of his life, where it was just kind of like, fuck, man, this is cruel. I mean, theirs not cruel. Theirs is just, they're just people doing a thing. But the Daniel Johnston stuff was like, this just seemed weirdly predatory. Like he's like on stage shaking.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, I saw Daniel Johnston in 2015, and with his band, and it was a couple of years later he died, and I kind of knew. I was like, when I saw him, I was like, this is my last opportunity to see him. And yeah, his stuff was like worse because at the final stages of his life, like he had like really bad like Parkinson's or just some kind of like uncontrollable tremors. So he's just like really infirm, and he's wheelchair bound, and he's on stage, and he's just kind of like shaking like really bad, and just kind of getting through this performance. And to his credit, like he still killed it. Like it wasn't like watching somebody like trying to perform and just like not being able to do it, and it just kind of being like, well, at least I'm here or whatever. Like he was killing it. But yeah, it was really sad. And once again, that cognitive dissonance of this deeply mentally ill guy suffering from these horrific health problems at the final stages of his life, just backed by these like 30-year-old like generic rock band people just being like, so strange.
Yeah, just for the record, I feel like we should have said this earlier, but just for the record, if you're not familiar, Daniel Johnston was a musical artist and visual artist, like who kind of got popular during the 1990s, and he kind of was a DIY artist initially, where he recorded all of the music that he made himself, but he didn't understand. He's kind of an outsider artist like the Shaggs to a certain degree, but with more craft. But he didn't understand that you could dupe tapes. So whenever he would make a new cassette tape to give to somebody or to sell, he would just record the whole thing over again. So he would basically play hundreds and hundreds of concerts for these recordings. And he kind of gained, a cult following in the 90s. That very famous photo of Kurt Cobain wearing a t-shirt with a little frog on it says, "Hello, how are you?" That's the cover to one of his records. He made music for a while and then kind of stopped doing that. And he's transitioned into making illustrations and drawings and paintings. And they're very similarly outsider-y, where it's kind of like him drawing a weird fucked up Captain America eating an ice cream cone, and you're kind of like, is this good because of the context of this person is mentally ill? And is this exploitative? Or is it just interesting in the way that he's making these marks and kind of like distorting the ideas of pop culture symbols? And yeah, there's a whole conversation to be had around the problematic exploitation of him and his mental illness, but his music is great.
Yeah, I mean, I love Daniel Johnston. I'm fine with the visual art stuff, but yeah, I love Daniel Johnston's music.
Yeah, I do too. And unlike the Shaggs, it's heartbreaking in completely different ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really, it's so sad.
Yeah,
and yeah, if you're into sad music, go look up Daniel Johnston.
Yeah, and like I said, I saw him in 2015, and it was one of the best concert experiences. It's kind of a singular experience to have that I am very glad that I did. Throughout the years, the Shaggs have worked their way into pop culture in various ways. They've been referenced in film and TV, such as The Gilmore Girls, Empire Records, and The Perks of Being a Wallflower. They boast celebrity fans such as the band Guster and Men Who Stare at Goats author John Ronson. In 2011, a stage musical was produced off-Broadway based on their lives.
You're in a band? Like a rock band?
How can we just stop going to school? My dad knows what he's doing.
It's gonna make us money.
What if we don't want to practice anymore?
That's what I raised you to do. Now stop!
That is 100% my idea of a good time.
I mean, just the idea of like this is from 2011, so this thing is long. I mean, live theater is dead forever. Like, I don't know if it's ever coming back, but this ended like fucking almost a decade ago. But yeah,
that is to just be able so my idea of a good time.
To be able to go in and just see this weird ass fucking musical about this fucking story. Yeah, I wish hopefully there's a tape of that somewhere. I'd like to see that. I'd like to.
Yeah, I would absolutely
be able to see a taping of that somewhere.
Last year when Nicole and I went to New York Comic Con, we flew in Thursday night, and the only thing I wanted to do when we were in New York was go see this play that was being put on at a little experimental theater. And poor Nicole, I made her run through the rain. We got to the hotel, dumped our bags, and then literally ran like 13 blocks through the pouring rain to get to this theater to see this play. And the name of the play was Ditko. And it was a play all about Steve Ditko and his, him creating Spider-Man and his obsession with Ayn Rand and his weird beef with Stan Lee and his relationship with Jack Kirby and, his entire, the arc of his life. And it was worth every moment of sprinting.
Worth
it so much.
Nicole actually fell into a manhole on the way there and you never saw her again.
Yeah, I sacrificed her to the Ditko gods.
Yeah. And I also wanted to show you a little bit of this band practice of when they were rehearsing for a concert for the Better Than the Beatles tribute album.
In relative tuning, which probably should be maybe the crown and the Framus. It's going to become a shit show anyway.
Can I put my 2 cents in about that?
Yes.
Really? When you're out of tune, it's really much more grating in a live context than it is on the record, so you really should be closer to concert tuning than the record is. Don't go nuts with replicating
So this is kind of an example of what we were talking about earlier, of kind of like the outsider pure expression kind of being ruined by this sort of academic professional understanding of music theory. And I just find this video so fascinating from a perspective of just watching these like hipster music heads coming at this music from a technicals perspective and trying to quantify how to perform it in the asymmetrical, atonal way that it was originally performed. It's so fascinating to me. So they like literally have like all of the parts of this like charted. So they have sheet music that has charted out all of the different parts and quantified like all of the time signatures, all the different changes in tempo and things like that. And they're performing this in this sort of like compositional way where there's like literally a conductor who's conducting like all of the different parts and leading them through all the different cues and rhythms to try to like exactly recreate how the original recording sounded.
It's really painful.
Yeah. I mean,
it's really painful. It's also really painful the level of seriousness that they're taking it.
Yeah.
Like, it's really painful.
I like the idea of covering Shaggs songs, but like doing something new with it, like taking what they did and like turning one of those songs into like more of a straightforward sort of like
like they did in the musical.
Yeah, conventionally pleasant sounding song. I like that idea. And I kind of want to do it myself, actually. But the idea of being like, yeah, we're gonna like recreate the rawness of it, and we've like charted out all the different parts, and we know all the different time signature changes, and there's somebody like conducting. It's so strange to watch in a room full of adults.
You know what that's like? That's like the equivalent of when you're in art school and there's like that super white teacher who's teaching African dance.
Yeah.
That's what that's like.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, totally. It's a lack of self-awareness in a whole other way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
At this point,
it's a lack of self-awareness that begets a supreme level of entitlement almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like
if I just, if I quantify each one of the time signatures and choose how to replicate the Shaggs rawness, then it'll produce the same effect it's the same thing of like whenever you're in a discussion with someone about like character design or storytelling in movies or film direction, or if somebody has to bring up that they have a degree in something as their point to try and win an argument, they've lost. Because if you can't explain in words why you think something works or doesn't work, like, oh, I don't like this fight scene because I feel like the camera is placed too close to the actors, or, oh, I really hated this scene because the way that they broke the 180-degree line wasn't purposeful, or I really hated the way that this, or I really loved this because I thought this character's costume and this thing was so well in tune with their character because of X, Y, and Z reason. These little details pulled out the texture of the character or whatever. You could tell by the tie they were wearing or the cufflinks they had, where it's like that conversation inevitably ends with somebody being like, I spent a lot of money and went to school to have a degree in this, so I know. Which is just like the most frustrating and annoying component of that conversation, where it's like we're supposed to be having a conversation theoretically about, these academic building blocks of storytelling, and you're not actually engaging in the building blocks. You're just saying, well, I just know them already. It's fine because I paid money.
Yeah. Nobody wants to see these guys on stage, like trying to use like music theory to like replicate the chaos of this song. Like, if
we just tune down all the guitars 1/2 step, it'll replicate the severe trauma that the Wiggins sisters went through.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. Very strange. And once again, it just goes back to that thing of like looking down your nose at these outsider artists and kind of like watching them like animals in a zoo. But in reality, like, you also lack self-awareness in this way that's kind of baffling to people observing your behavior. So, as they say in the great film Star Wars Episode 1, Phantom Menace, there's always a bigger fish.
That's like the third time you've made that joke. I refuse to let this go. No, we don't do this. Come on, we're better than this.
There's just something so funny to me about using that as a point of reference for trying to make like poignant statements on things. Want to buy some death sticks? You do not want to sell me death sticks. You want to go home and rethink your life. At this point, the Shaggs legacy in music history is firmly established, and they have a fairly large cult fan base. However, that fan base is divided between the true fans who understand the pure, raw, emotional expression of innocence in the Shaggs music, the fact that Philosophy of the World was birthed out of a once-in-a-lifetime coalescence of outsider divination and processing of deep trauma, and the people who just think it's fun to ironically listen to a weird, so bad it's good band.
Most people that would call themselves Shaggs fans are people that I hate. People that simply don't get it. People that say, you gotta hear this, man, it's so awful, it's great. No. First of all, there's nothing that's so awful it's great. And second of all, if there was, this would not qualify. This is just a pure expression of what was in somebody's head, somebody who was literally forced to make music and didn't want to do this. She drew on what she had. I don't want to single that out. They all drew on what they had in terms of ability, and they came up with this pure expression that is what it is, and it's glorious for being what it is.
The point I want to make really quickly about that is earlier this year when I was in Chicago for C2E2, you're at conventions, you go out to dinner afterwards, and you're meeting new people and having these conversations, and sometimes they kind of
you go out to conventions and you go to dinner. No, I don't understand any of that, Dave. None of that makes any sense to me. Going to a convention, being out to dinner, those things don't happen.
Right, exactly. But you in the year 2030, you go out to dinner with people at conventions, and sometimes you get seated by people you don't know, because, these kind of large cliques of cartoonists go out to dinner afterwards, and you end up almost kind of having job interviews with each other, where you kind of start talking about the things you like and the artists you're interested in and your influences and so on and so forth. And somebody was asking me about, because cartoonists spend so much time alone, when they are together, everybody wants to talk about very specific, minute details of things, which then lead into very specific, minutia-oriented conversations. And when we were in Chicago, I was having a conversation about the types of movies that I'm drawn to. Not necessarily what's your favorite movie, but like, what are the characteristics, what are the building blocks of a movie that just instantly make you interested? And for me, it's usually authenticity and attempting to do something great. You don't even have to succeed at that, but the intention is what I'm really drawn to a lot. Like, I love noble failure movies. I love movies that are like trying to be the greatest movie ever, but they have $5. You know, I love, like, it's sincerity and hubris. Those are the two things that I tend to latch onto. Like, one of my favorite movies is The Black Hole, which on its face is just a shitty Disney ripoff of Star Wars. But when you actually watch that movie, like, they are trying to make a thing. And
now available on Disney Plus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This episode is sponsored by Walt Disney's Ghost.
Who's hanging out with Austin Wiggins' ghost in hell.
Both noted anti-Semites. The thing though about the Shaggs music is that it's interesting because it's both of those things. It's sincere. They're trying to make good music, but they don't have the skill set to do it. And there's hubris that's fueling it. But the thing that's fascinating about it to me is that it's not the hubris of the individuals involved. It's like a game of telephone hubris, which is just so fascinating.
Yeah, and I totally get the sentiment too, because you know, I mean, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more later and just kind of like the discussion, but I love outsider music. I love avant-garde music. I love noise. I love a lot of like really experimental music that you know, just sort of breaks conventional form and creates new unique ideas. And I've always sort of been notorious with my like friend group as like just being into like weird pretentious bullshit, which is like the thing that people sort of label it as. And it's always very like disheartening. It's frustrating for people to label it as that and kind of like, oh, like Andrew, he just likes this weird shit. Like almost like making this assumption that I'm only into it because it's like weird and I'm like being weird. And obviously there's certainly some level of pretentiousness associated with it, but it's disheartening for people to just really only think about it at the surface level like that. And I remember whenever I was in high school, I had a noise group called the Palindrome. It was me and a couple friends, and we did sort of noise performance art. When I was in high school, I lived in Bakersfield, California, which is like a very conservative area of California. And also during this time, whenever there was like very specific types of music that were very popular, especially in this town. And, you know, so when I was in high school, like what was specifically popular at the time was kind of this just like really generic alternative metal, kind of an evolution of like the new metal craze of the 90s that had
Wake up, I'll take you on.
Yeah, exactly. 3 Days Grace and fucking
Puddle of Mud.
Yeah, it was a very specific type of music that was popular.
Mud flap rock.
And so in where I grew up, there was sort of like this, like being in the music scene and going out to concert venues and things like that. There was this like specific division in the groups of people who were into music and going out to see music. So you had like those people who were just like really into like the generic like alternative metal rock music. And there was actually this alt metal band in Bakersfield called E-Race that was like that. It was like that like Taproot or like Trapped type music or whatever. And then there was like the punks who were into like hardcore and punk music. And then there was like the metalheads who were into death metal and grindcore and blast beat and all this stuff. And they were all very specifically compartmentalized and segmented. And it was just like, you are just a punk guy and you are this type of person and you're this type of person. And it's funny because like thinking back on it, what we were trying to do was actually very similar to the thing that Andrew WK talked about of like trying to unite everybody with music in that way, because the concept behind what we were doing is like, I just really was hung up on this idea that like these like labels were very arbitrary and the labels created the division. So this idea that like you associate with this specific label that has been created by a consumerist society. So they literally just create the genre of music so that they can market it and sell it in stores. Literally, so it has a place on the CD rack where you go to get it. And through that capitalist consumerist labeling of art for the purposes of being able to market to you, they create ideological separation between people. But it's all ultimately meaningless, and it doesn't make any sense to just only like metal or only like punk music or whatever. It didn't make any sense to me. So what I wanted to do was go and get booked on different types of shows, at like a punk show, and get booked at like a death metal show, and get booked at like whatever, like any type of show that was going on in the city, and just be the one band on this platform that was this wildly different thing. And just to kind of like break down and make a mockery of the idea that these labels actually meant anything. And so we were performing at this show at this kind of fairly famous venue in Bakersfield called Jerry's Pizza. It's got a lot of history.
That is the most Bakersfield venue.
Yeah.
It's just a pizza place.
Well, it's like a pizza place, and then they have a basement, and like it's got a little bit of history, and it's like kind of like where the scene is, and like anytime a band comes through, they, you know, obviously like not huge bands like Foo Fighters or something like that, but like Tool played there, and the Melvins played there, and tons of other people. But we were performing there. We played our show, and like I said, our show is just kind of this abstract improvisational noise music that uses a lot of vocal improvisation and manipulating pre-recorded snippets of audio on a looper where you can loop things and stretch things out and add effects to them. Just a lot of stuff like that. So we did this whole show, and after the show, somebody came up to me and they said, "That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my entire life, and I loved it." And that was so the opposite of what I was like going for, that it was very disheartening. And I really resented that type of reaction to the things that I made, that it was just nonsensical, weird bullshit. That I totally relate to this idea of this anger and frustration of people just not getting it. And not that it's even complex. Like we didn't take ourselves seriously. It wasn't like, oh, you need to appreciate this art. It's art. Like we didn't take ourselves seriously at all. In fact, our shows had a lot of like weird satirical comedic elements to them. So it wasn't like you need to appreciate this art and take it seriously, but just the idea of like, this is just nonsensical, weird bullshit. I just was very resentful of that idea. So I totally understand the frustration with living alongside. So you're in this fan base or this cult scene based around this type of music or this band like the Shaggs, but you're sort of alongside these other people that you feel like just don't understand it truly, and they're liking it for the wrong reasons. As much as I feel like some of these more kind of like pretentious music people are a little elitist, I still understand where they're coming from on that front. So even the people who didn't quite understand the appeal of music probably wouldn't understand the concept of outsider music if you tried to explain it to them. Have to admit that there's something about the record that makes it stand apart from just terrible music. Although he once actively tried to convince Austin not to record this music because he thought it was so bad, engineer of the Shaggs' own Thing recordings, Jeff Landrock, now feels differently about the music he helped create.
Today, people, say the Shaggs. I mean, I don't go around saying, hey, do you know the Shaggs? But it just comes up. I love the Shaggs. I love the Shaggs music. And yeah, well, I did that,
What did they say?
Same as you're asking me. What was it like? What did you think? I didn't know what to think. It was kind of like a shock. It was like, is this really happening? And there's been a lot of people who have tried to reproduce anything even coming close to what the Shaggs did. And it seems like nobody can do it, because nobody can do it. It's probably like trying to learn 17 different languages in, a short amount of time and throw them all together.
There's something also funny to me about that. And there's also like, I didn't include any of it in here, but there's a lot of interviews with the Fremont, New Hampshire town historian who like, they clearly have very few things to talk about in the annals of the Fremont, New Hampshire history, because a large component of the history that he preserves is just all about the Shaggs. And I find it very funny that there are people like this guy, this town historian, and then the guy, the engineer who recorded the music, who at the time just thought it was a horrible band of people who didn't know how to play music, and he felt bad for taking their money.
I mean, it is. That's literally what it is.
Yeah, but
but that also doesn't mean it's not great.
Yeah, but I find it funny, these people who never in a million years would have any conception of what outsider music was, they would be those people that don't understand the subtle quality of this type of music. They wouldn't get why it's good, and they would just look at it at face value as just horrible shit. But since they were kind of a part of it in some way, they've retconned their involvement with it and are retroactively trying to pretend like they think it's great. Because that this guy does not think this. This guy's not like, oh yeah, like it's like learning 7 different languages. Like he was a part of it, and now in retrospect, he's just trying to associate himself with this thing that became popular and be a part of the story. So he's like kayfabing that he understands it and that he likes it. And this historian who's just like in a vacuum of nothing interesting going on in their town, he is embraced the Shaggs as this like important historical thing that existed in the town, even though probably in reality he's just like, what the fuck is this? Like, why do people like this? I don't get it. But whether you think that the Wiggins sisters were musical geniuses accidentally tapping into a primordial reservoir of inner truth, or just some untalented young girls who were forced to make weird shit by their controlling father, one thing is for sure. All those years ago, in the 1930s, Austin Wiggins' mother made a prediction that Austin would marry a strawberry blonde, have 2 sons, and then his daughters would go on to become a huge music group. And that prophecy was stretched on throughout the next several decades, carried along to a certain marker in the relay race by Austin himself, and he probably died thinking that he lived his life in vain, placing all his hopes and dreams into a foolish prediction his crackpot mother made when he was a child. But little did he know, he wasn't meant to be the one to see the prophecy fulfilled. And he wasn't the one destined to drag it screaming into existence. It was us, the fans, the weird, bearded dudes at record stores who played the album over the loudspeaker, the nerdy kids who stumbled across the LP searching through the stacks, or stumbled across a random video essay on the band on YouTube. It was always us who would help fulfill the prophecy. So, where does that leave the Shaggs themselves? This story is defined by 3 young girls dragged along on an adventure that wasn't theirs and they didn't want. And yet, at the end of the day, it happened. They are the Shaggs now. They'll forever be inextricably woven into the fabric of music history, and their music will forever exist in the hearts of millions of experimental music fans. So, how do they feel about it?
I still don't listen to it. My son listens to it.
Want the truth? I still don't think it's good.
So good. So good.
Yep. Act 3, Freedom to Live. So Austin was an abusive piece of shit, but his chaos magic was so strong, he willed success and literal music genius into existence for people that didn't even want it. Have you just the fact that his determination was so powerful that he created this entire thing. He bullshitted this into happening.
I'm kind of into that.
Like
I'm kind of love that.
Like there's so many people that you kind of get the sense that like no matter how the timeline shook out, it would always kind of end in them realizing their greatness. Like, you know, some pure musical genius with just this unyielding passion to express themselves to the world. They would have done it some way, somehow. They were given opportunities along the way, but ultimately like they would have gotten to the finish line by some methods, but none of this would ever have happened if he hadn't like forced it to happen out of thin air, basically, where it's just like and this is such the definition of chaos magic, because it's like his mom had this prediction and the prediction was bullshit because palm reading is not real, but it is because he made it happen. So he made a palm reading become real. And that something about that is just so fucking cool to me.
Or she was actually fucking psychic.
Yeah. I mean, that's another thing is like it feels like one of those like cautionary, be careful what you wish for type stories where it's like, you know, you will marry a strawberry blonde, and then you will have 2 sons after I die, and then you will have 3 daughters who will become a successful music group, and then you go through that whole thing, and then you die, and then later on that all happens, and then, you know, she's like, I never said that you would be alive when they became a successful music group. Like it's just it's like a twist ending.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that. What's that? Is it Judd Nelson? No. What? Judd Hirsch? You always reference it. What's that that not Twilight Zone show, or maybe it's a Twilight Zone reboot from the 90s?
Oh yeah. The rock and roll Twilight Zone reboot.
Yeah, where Judd, one of the Judds, plays a music A&R executive who can hear talent, and the people that he picks become massively famous. But then they die.
Yeah, in some horrible way.
Yeah, and the end of the episode is he gets the sensation of talent when his daughter is playing piano. And then he's like, "Oh no, I have to stop her." So he drops his ring in the garbage disposal and is like, "Hey, will you come get this thing out of the sink? I can't get it out."
Yeah, then
she puts her hand in there, and then it cuts to black.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally like that. Where it's like, yeah, technically, the prophecy never said that you wouldn't die of a heart attack in your sleep,
and then turn into a ghost
that haunted that house.
Yeah.
And then, you know, so especially Dot, and for reasons that we kind of talked about earlier, really underplays that time in her life and how it psychologically affected her and what it means about her dad. And just, you know, just systematically kind of presents it as like, oh yeah, we didn't really want to do it. It wasn't that fun. But our dad was just strict that way, and he was kind of kooky. And just underplays it because, like we said before, just the narrative that he was like a serial abuser just isn't as kosher when you're trying to like capitalize off of it. But in the periphery of that, there was that rumor back in the 60s which honestly, like, this fact might be completely separate from the rumor. The rumor might genuinely have just been a rumor from fucking nosy neighbors in the community and stuff like that. But they had this rumor that he was molesting them. Dot and Betty say that nothing like that ever happened, and they just roundly and flatly deny it. But Helen said that he did to her. She claimed that he was. She said it as they were intimate, or he was intimate with her, which just sounds like the way that a naive small town New England woman from the 60s would describe it. But the Dot and Betty say that nothing like that ever happened. However, it seems important to point out that of the three sisters that all three went through this like trauma over a period of years, Helen was the only one that ended up kind of suffering from like crippling depression that ultimately killed her. So, and she's the one that claimed that this happened to her. So, there's no way of ever knowing because they're both dead now. But given all the other information, it wouldn't be like mind blowing like finding out Bill Cosby was a fucking serial rapist. Like he was already doing fucked up shit that everyone was well aware of. So it's not a surprise.
It's a hop, skip, and a jump from I'm just going to keep you locked in this room playing guitar for 8 hours a day to I'm just going to keep you locked in this room playing guitars 8 hours a day. And also,
there's some part of me that feels a tremendous amount of sadness for him that he just like couldn't let go this weird prophecy thing that his mom told him when he was a kid and devoted the rest of his life to trying to do it, and he just didn't accomplish it. But then this element gets added to it, and then it's just like, oh no, he's a fucking monster. Fuck this guy.
Yeah, I feel like he's kind of a monster either way. Fuck this guy.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah, fuck this guy. He's a monster either way, certainly. But in a way, the things that we do are not far off from what he tried to force them to do. Like, for us, you making comics and, me working on this podcast and, some of my self-disciplinary behaviors surrounding working and throwing myself into work. We kind of...
And also the videos that you've been editing at 4 a.m. that everyone should go watch at the Deep Cuts Facebook page.
Facebook.com/deepcutspod. We kind of imprison ourselves. Like it's a self-imposed isolation away from the world. So his general approach to it, I kind of in theory don't disagree with. Not that you should force another person to do it, but in as far as he decided to try to force his daughters to do it, the way that he approached it in theory is not necessarily the wrong way to go about it, except for the fact that, I guess, what do you feel about that? Because I feel like aside from the fact that he was like forcing them to do it, and that's fucked up, the missing component to the entire thing was just that like they didn't care, like they had no interest or passion in the thing that they were doing, which was like the one missing component that made any of this function.
Yeah, it's interesting because they are Billie Eilish without passion.
Yeah.
Because this is almost literally Billie Eilish's story. Like her and her brother make music together. They were homeschooled so that they could low key not really go to school and just make music all day, which is why she was able to tour and make record contract obligations and travel the world at age 14 because she wasn't in school. And it's a very similar story on the level of like, there's kind of a, should you sacrifice your childhood in pursuit of the thing? And obviously it's very different when Billie Eilish is choosing to sacrifice her own childhood to pursue the thing. But also, did she or her parents purposefully or irresponsibly setting up an environment that allows her to shirk responsibilities that most well-centered people have to do, even though it's not fun? I don't know. I definitely am someone who has taken an unconventional path at almost every turn. Sometimes to great success, sometimes to great failure. But I mean, are you shocked that I'm like sitting inside of a room for 30 hours straight working on craft? That sounds like a good old time to me.
Yeah, but unfortunately the fatal flaw was that it did not sound like a good old time to them.
Yeah. And I probably, if someone was outside of that door cracking a whip, I probably would not have wanted to do it either.
Yeah.
Which it's a big difference. the thing that's so fascinating to me is that because you don't get stories like this in comics, like there just aren't examples because it's not a medium that is read by a wide enough body of humans. So when there is like some sort of person from the past who's exalted by a smaller group, it just doesn't have this. Like there isn't really a cult comic book creator in the way that there are cult musicians or cult movie, directors or whatever, where things kind of bubble up to the surface 50 years after they were popular. I mean, the closest probably is like Fletcher Hanks, who made a book called Stardust the Super Wizard, which was his attempt at making a bizarro Superman. Like he was trying to sell out, but this guy was fucking crazy, and all of his comics don't like just they're like someone who's not from Earth made them. Like instead of the Superman character Stardust coming down and like imprisoning the bad guy who's robbing a bank, he turns the bad guy's hands to lead and then throws them in a river. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like really weird. Like, I'm going to now take your soul and imprison it inside of this jug and put this jug in the refrigerator of your wife as she gets remarried. Like, it's like bizarre, nonsensical, insane things that are just like, this is what you think a commercial viability is like product is shaped like. This is so weird. But I'm fascinated by the fact that all of this happened over 100 records. That is so cool to me. And it makes me have like a broader sense of faith that like something I do at one point in life will be cool and mean something to somebody somewhere someday. Because 100 fucking records is nothing.
Yeah, I mean,
and like,
I think I forget if I told you about this or not, but whenever I was in high school, I worked. There was this musician that I met on the internet on MySpace back whenever like MySpace was the thing, and there was like MySpace Music, and there was a lot of bands on MySpace Music, and I was talking to this musician, and we collaborated together on making this cover of this song from Super Mario RPG. It was called Mallow's Theme, and it was just the theme song for one of the characters, one of the playable characters in your party, who's this little anthropomorphic marshmallow guy. And so we did this song together where it was basically like this sort of like drum and bass, like circusy sounding song that had a little bit of like an industrial vibe to it. And he did all the guitar and I did all the production and I sang on it. And it was just this weird thing that we started talking about Super Mario RPG, and he was saying that he was like wanting to cover something, and we just did it together. And he was just some guy. Like he put out music that was kind of like he would make like this very like metally, like technical guitar music. And that was back when I was in high school. It was like up on his MySpace music page, and it was just a thing that I did. Probably got like 50 listens or something like that. And I don't even remember how I forgot how this ended up happening, but relatively recently, like several months ago, I just somehow stumbled across it on Google somehow searching, and I discovered that this song had been put on this like official Super Mario RPG tribute album that was like released by a record label.
What?
Yeah. And it was just, the song was on it. And it was like, it was credited to my old like musical persona.
What?
Yeah, and I just accidentally found this on like Googling myself or something. Maybe I was like, I remembered the song and I was like trying to find it, and I was like, oh, maybe it's like, maybe I can find it like uploaded to some server or something. I don't remember why, but I just started searching for it, and I just stumbled across this fact. And I have no idea. I don't know how that happened. I guess maybe he somehow got it onto the album or something. But yeah, and that was like, this was like, I graduated from high school in 2006. I think I probably did it around 2006. So, over a decade later, this random thing I made in high school, just accidentally discovered that it was put onto an official Super Mario RPG tribute album.
This has been Deep Cuts. I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Andrew Price.
You can find me online at heydavebaker.com. You can find my comics, Fuck Off Squad and Action Hospital there, as well as many others. Where can they find you online, Andrew?
You can find me locked in a basement, inventing the concept of music in a vacuum. And you can also find me at dapricerights.com, where you can buy my comic, Deadbolt, AI Private Eye. It's about robots solving crimes. Deep Cuts is a production by Boy Genius Media. If you'd like to find this show and others like it, please visit boygeniusmedia.com or deepcutspod.com.
If you want to join in on post-episode discussions, please join the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group. Finally, subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional video content.
When you're on the road